Principia College's live coverage of the 2020 election. My name is Sophie Hills, and I'm here with my fellow anchors, Delaney Gatine, Dana Cady, and Chris Strong. This is going to be an exciting night, with not only the presidential race to focus on, but also key Senate and House races to look out for. We'll be providing live updates throughout the night, so stay tuned. We've got a great evening of analysis and interviews planned, put together by the Mass Communication and Political Science departments, with hefty support from Media Services. For the next hour, we'll be hearing from more than 45 students from 5 different political science and mass communication classes. Some have been monitoring close U.S. House and Senate races around the country, all involving women. Others will give their analysis of issues related to the races this year, such as partisan leanings of religious traditions, U.S. relations with China and Russia, and stresses on the U.S. electorate. And, of course, we'll receive an update on the presidential election. We'll also hear from some outside guests, including editor and publisher of the Quorum Report, Harvey Kronberg, notable political scientist from the University of New Hampshire, Dr. Dante Scala, and Story Hinckley, a political correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. Let's first go to 6 students from the 2020 Race for the White House field program and hear their takeaways about the nomination process and the presidential candidates they met.
Hi, we're 6 students from the 2020 Race to the White House field program, here today to reflect on our experience and share with you what we did. I'm Sarah Geis, and I'm a senior.
I'm Cassidy Proctor, and I'm a junior.
I'm Dana Cady. I'm also a junior.
I graduated in May.
I'm Liam Anderson. I also graduated in May.
And I'm Delaney Gatine, and I'm a junior.
So the purpose of our program was to sort of examine the presidential nominating process, particularly in the 2 states of Iowa and New Hampshire, because historically they have determined who's going to be the next president, essentially, or close, who ends up being the top 2 nominees for the US elections. And to prepare for our trip, we took a parties and elections class where we analyzed how, as a whole, the presidential elections work. And then we had a seminar class where we sort of took a deep dive into Iowa and New Hampshire and their specific nominating processes. And so Stephen and Liam were going to talk a bit about the importance of this nominating process.
Yeah, so we spent a week in Iowa and then went to spend a week in New Hampshire, each for the primary and the caucus. So Iowa obviously has the famous first caucus, which is the first election type thing in the primary process. So it's a bit of a harder process to understand than a caucus. You kind of have to separate into groups. You have caucus leaders who all support candidates, and once you get there, it's more of an event. So you go, it's a social event most of the time, and you're there petitioning for whatever candidate you like and trying to swing the undecideds to your side. So there'll be one first round of voting where you kind of count how many supporters you have, and then you'll be able to calculate your viability threshold, which is the number of supporters you need to have in order to actually be viable, which I believe in most elections that's somewhere around 15% long. But if you don't have enough supporters in round 1 to be viable, you have to go in the second round and find another candidate to support. And then in that second round, those final numbers are the ones where you actually that's kind of how the very brief way that how a caucus works and how very different it is from a primary. And you can also at a caucus form an undecided group, where if there's enough people who are viable, who are able to form a group where they don't support any of the candidates, they can do that, and those delegates actually still go on to the next level. So sometimes you'll have a percentage of people at a caucus who are undecided, and those delegates move forward. So Liam, do you want to touch on any more of that, on maybe a primary a little bit more in a caucus?
Sure. Yeah, I'll go a little bit more into the caucus and then I'll hit the primary. So with the caucus, what's interesting about the Iowa caucus is there's all these different levels, what Stephen kind of touched on a little bit there. And so the thing is with that is that if there are a certain amount of people that get, a certain amount of delegates that are elected at the precinct level, that might change at the district level. And then at the very end, it might change in the state level. And so those things can change based on which candidates drop out, which candidates stay in, and kind of how the tide turns in the election process. With the primary process, what's interesting with New Hampshire is they have semi-closed primaries, which means that when they go to the election, they have to generally be registered to a party. So when they walk in, they have to pick a party, they take that ballot and they go in and kind of do, like a normal vote, check mark the box and go from there. And so they kind of go about doing their voting thing with the semi-closed primaries. You can be an independent, but you have to register as a certain party to vote, but then you can uncheck the registered box as you leave, and you can go back to being independent, which is what some folks in New Hampshire do. And so that's kind of the basis of the caucus and primary process. Stephen, do you have anything else to add?
One last thing that's a huge factor is that in caucuses you have to be there for the entire, sometimes 2-3 hour ordeal for your vote to matter. Like I said, it's more of an event and it's more of a tough process rather than at a primary. You can go in, vote, be out of there in 5 minutes. So it's a lot more of a hassle, you could say, or for some people it's fun, on a weekday night going out to the caucus and participating in that for a couple hours.
Guys, so as I sort of alluded to earlier, these two states, Iowa and New Hampshire, have been historically significant in determining the nominees, the final two for the presidential election. And so Cassidy, as we all know, Biden did not win Iowa or New Hampshire in the nomination contest for those two states. So Cassidy was going to talk a bit about how this has some important historical implications for the future.
Yeah, so in this last Iowa caucus, Buttigieg won with 26.2%, with Bernie Sanders close behind at 26.1%, and then Elizabeth Warren behind at 18% of the vote. And then in New Hampshire, it was Bernie Sanders up top, followed by, followed by I think like Buttigieg or Warren. They were tied pretty closely there. And so Biden didn't make it in either one of those states, which, at least for me, and I think for a few other people in the class, we were like, oh, it's not really looking very good for him. And I definitely do not think that he would get as far as he did, let alone be the nomination, until he hit South Carolina, where Biden got 48.6% of the state's delegates. So it definitely caught a lot of people by surprise. And then you had the quick succession of candidates dropping out to support Biden and then moving on to help him get the Democratic nominee and get him to where he is today. So that is very historical, considering that has not happened in many cycles. I think it hasn't happened since the 70s, but I'm not entirely sure on that. And it was, very fascinating to kind of see where, kind of what's next for Iowa and New Hampshire after this very dramatic change in this historical dip.
Yeah, for a long time, people have not liked that Iowa is the first state to have their nomination contest, because they're like, why Iowa? It's this Midwestern state that doesn't really have a lot of significance to a lot of other states. But and it's interesting because a lot of people were really watching the caucus this year and being like, is it going to be successful? Because they did a lot of new changes to its structure. And I think now that it's kind of shown that there are exceptions, like Iowa and New Hampshire don't always determine who's going to be a presidential nominee, they might lose their spot as first in the nation. So who knows what will happen? This is going to be interesting to see going forward. And another thing that we did while we were on this trip, actually, we all had a field project where we kind of focused on a topic, and then we went out and interviewed a lot of people to find trends on like what's going on and what we're studying. And for example, I studied what makes a candidate viable, and Dana spent a lot of time on news coverage for political candidates. So in relation to what Cassie was just talking about, she found some really interesting things about Biden and the other candidates that may have influenced why Biden ended up winning, even if he didn't get Iowa and New Hampshire.
Yeah, definitely. Like Sarah said, my project was focused on news coverage and the news presence at these campaign events that we were fortunate enough to attend. And it was very interesting because we were able to attend an event for Joe Biden in New Hampshire at a small little town towards the end of our 2 weeks there. And while part of my job on this abroad as part of my research project was counting how many individual news outlets were at each of these events. And so for Biden's event, I counted 12, and that there were probably more. That's just like the ones that I was able to like specifically identify. And I broke it up into like national/international and also like local outlets. And so seeing kind of the convergence of those two types of media outlets. And so I counted 12 in total for Biden. And then actually for Elizabeth Warren, when we went to her event in Iowa, I technically counted 13. So technically she had one more than Biden, but they were very close. They were probably like more close than I even think, because I couldn't count all of them. But yeah, it was very interesting to just see how popular both Biden and Warren were. I think Warren had a leg up for a lot of those 2 weeks while we were there, leading up to the primary process, just because she definitely appealed to, especially in the Northeast, like where New Hampshire is, she was definitely appealing to those voters. But it was very surprising to see how popular the Biden event was in New Hampshire. It was packed. There were tons of people and tons of reporters. And the significance that I found, even though technically I counted one more that Warren had in terms of a news outlet, I found that the number of local outlets were actually like more present at Biden's event. So like technically he captured a wider range of reporters for both the local aspect and the national aspect. So that was very interesting. It was very crowded. It was very like people were very excited to meet him and to take selfies with him, which we were able to do. So there was definitely a lot of enthusiasm for him, even though the results showed that he didn't actually get that far up in the final decision for the primary. But there was definitely a lot of enthusiasm, and that probably made some difference in him becoming the eventual nominee that we have now.
Thanks for sharing, Dana. So the last thing we kind of wanted to briefly talk about was some of the things we did in Iowa and New Hampshire, and that was mostly getting to see the candidates that were running. Unfortunately, there weren't a ton of opportunities to interact with any Republican candidates, considering Trump was the kind of decided nominee. So we spent a lot of time with Democratic candidates, and we're just going to kind of highlight on Biden since he's our presidential Democratic nominee for this election. And so Delaney wanted to share some of her thoughts on how that went.
Yeah, so I thought that the event with Biden and our interactions with him were really interesting because out of all the events we attended, I left the Biden event feeling like he had put the most like genuine effort into it, which was interesting because, everyone has their different favorite candidates and everyone has their different political views, but Biden had really made an effort to connect with the individuals in his audience. And, you know, there was this interaction where he came over to actually our group and brought us all into a huddle and was just telling us how important our generation is and that we need to be involved in politics and vote no matter what your politics are, get involved, vote. And I thought that was such an interesting thing for him to do, and just to appeal to like the humanity of everyone that was there. And out of all of the candidates, I couldn't necessarily explain why, but I think that a lot of us felt like our sorry about that. A lot of us felt like our experience with Biden was something that was kind of a little bit different and more personal than our experience with the rest of the candidates.
Well, thank you all for sharing. And that's unfortunately all we have time for today for this Print at the Polls segment. But we hope that we kind of shed a little bit of light on maybe the continued importance of Iowa and New Hampshire, maybe not. But yeah, so stay tuned and look out for some more cool content for tonight's showing.
Thanks so much for that. Next, I'd like to welcome Olivia Denson, one of the 17 students from the Women in Politics class who've been monitoring races involving women. Olivia, you've been following the important Senate race in Maine between the Republican incumbent Susan Collins and her Democratic challenger Sarah Gideon, and that race is quite close. How could Maine's approval and use of ranked choice voting play a role in this election?
Thanks, Sophie. Maine is actually one of the few states to use this ranked choice voting, where voters rank their choices of candidates in order of preference. So if either candidate does not achieve majority vote by the end of the first night, then they're subject to the next ranked choice voting round, where those first votes that didn't receive majority receive the second choice and the potential to either progress or to be eliminated. And this process of counting up the voters' second, third, fourth, and so on choices takes place days after the election process, so that it kind of postpones the results quite significantly. So this could result in some people thinking it's a certain way when reality a few days will show that it's not. And the runoff of the second round of ranked choice is actually in Gideon's favor, as a recent poll found that she would pick up about 61% of the votes cast towards the independents in the first round that didn't gain the majority. And that's compared to Collins' 41%. So they're about 21% difference. And we see a lot of user errors with regular ballots. That's definitely something that's frequent. So it's important to consider the immense margin of error with these tedious ranked choice ballots as well. And it really could play to their advantage if they have strong voters that are secure in their choice of vote and only vote for either candidate, which opts them out of the ranked choice system. But is this highly probable? And do the Maine voters really understand what ranked choice could imply?
Has the recent swearing in of Amy Coney Barrett as Supreme Court Justice had any impact on this Senate election?
Collins was actually the only Republican in the entire Senate to vote against the nomination for Amy Coney Barrett. So this is reflecting the pressure that she feels to appeal to the generally more moderate Maine. A lot of the voters tend to be more moderate or liberal there. So a lot of them may be interpreting this as a last-ditch effort to appeal to these moderate voters, where Gideon appeals to them by default. So in a case like this, it truly comes down to one of those candidates being someone that appeals to moderate voters based off of how they have voted previously or previous decisions they've made. And Collins voted to not impeach Trump, as well as supported the 2017 Trump tax cuts. And she also voted to confirm the controversial 2018 Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, all of which have the potential to sway moderate voters, canceling out her vote against Amy Coney Barrett, ultimately turning them a little bit off to her.
And what has the dynamic been between the two candidates?
This race has actually been dubbed by numerous news outlets as nasty. And I think this is mainly a result of the way that Collins has been accusing Gideon of smearing her name and damaging her reputation. that she's really spent the past 4 terms building through the candidacy process and learning how to appeal to the more moderate and liberal voters and differentiating herself from the conservative Republican side that she identifies with. And we're seeing a lot of influx in young voters this election season, and then pairing that with the polarized political environment that we're seeing in the US right now, it definitely makes for a large social media presence that's a little bit negative and a lot more of a disagreement rather than supporting the candidates. And there have been a lot of ads put out by the Collins campaign that is a little bit more negative and then is creating that negative tone throughout the candidacy process. But so far the dynamic has been fairly civil, but we are seeing these blips on the radar along the way that the ugliness that is politics is rearing its head. And so the race has really started to assume a negative tone.
Well, the presidential race has also been heated at times, and has that created any challenges for either candidate with gathering their own votes in Maine?
Yeah, it really has. We're just seeing such a polarized climate right now politically in the US. So however people are aligning, it tends to be really heightened right now. And so with this, the candidates are automatically going to appeal or to deter voters based on their political alignment alone. And this is something that's unique to having a presidential race simultaneously with the Senate race, and it adds just a little bit extra potential to either hurt or to help. And Collins is genuinely having a harder time with voters because they're becoming less willing to differentiate her from her party just based off of what's happening in recent news and everything. And earlier in her previous campaign, she was really able to convince and receive those liberal votes, whereas right now she's struggling with it, and less people are able to support the bipartisanship, and Biden voters are becoming less willing to see past those key votes that Collins made that I referenced earlier, which really has jeopardized her state. And Gideon really is starting to become just a natural spot for those Maine voters who generally are moderate to go to.
Well, I know it's early yet, and we're not really getting any results from Maine at this point in the night, but is there a candidate that you think will be able to pull it out?
I personally have, just based off of what I see in the polls and what I've been reading in the articles and everything, it looks like there is a very slight chance of Gideon really taking this and running with it and winning this race. But it is hard to say. It would be really impressive for a Democrat to defeat an incumbent Republican. Like, we really don't know quite yet, and I'm very curious to find out.
Well, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Sophie.
Let's go now to Chris Ajuga, who's been tracking the House race in New York's 2nd congressional district between Democrat Jackie Gordon and Republican Andrew Garbarino, who are vying for an open seat. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Sophie. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. So both candidates in the race that you're watching are relatively new to politics and are very much unknown. What edge does Gordon, the Democrat, have against Garbarino, the Republican?
Well, Gordon has served almost 3 decades in public service. This is similar to Peter King, who's the incumbent who chose not to vie last year in November. And, she served as a town councilwoman in Babylon. She has also served as a public school educator. She has spent her entire life as a vet. So this is something that the people of Long Island in the 2nd Congressional District of New York really look to. They want someone who has a sense of community, and that is the only way that Gordon can really show them that I am the best option at the moment.
And what are Gordon's views on Donald Trump?
Well, this year, the liberals are really liberal. they are really fighting for their own, while the Republicans are also holding their front. However, Gordon is very coy. Anytime she's asked about Donald Trump, she'll respond very coyly, and she has also openly said that she's willing to work with the other side. This is something that we've not really seen in 2020, so I think that is in a district that has voted for the Republicans for the past 3 decades. That is something that the voters there want to know. Are you still willing to support some of the views that we have held for almost 3 decades while bringing in a new point of view?
So this district, the 2nd Congressional District of New York, has voted Republican for almost 30 years. How does Gordon plan to swing voters left after that record?
Well, the only thing Gordon has in her bag that is her largest ace is the fact that Gordon supports the Affordable Care Act. This is something that American voters this year are really looking into because they demand for better healthcare, and Gordon is at the forefront of saying, listen, I support the Affordable Care Act, and her opponent, Garbarino, a Republican, is really pushing for taxes, better taxes, the return of source taxes in Long Island, because he's a big supporter of local businesses and local industries. So it really is a toss-up battle royale for the people of Long Island, because will they go for Gordon, who's offering them better healthcare, or will they go for Garbarino, who is offering them lower taxes for small businesses? So this race, it's very interesting, and you can't really project who might win because they're both relatively new. They both have really strong people backing them up, with Garbarino, who has Peter King, who has been at the helm for almost 3 decades. And then we have Gordon, who's a woman of color, who's an immigrant from Jamaica, who has Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and Barack Obama saying, listen, this is a good woman. So the people of Long Island have a lot to consider.
And I know it's early, but at this point in the night, does it seem like Gordon's strategy is panning out, or are things leaning in the other direction towards Garbarino?
Well, Sophie, it is 4:26 in Nairobi right now, and I have been looking everywhere online for the past almost 9 hours to see how the people of Long Island might swing. And at this point, all I can say is both of them have an equal fighting chance. This state is very outlooked because it's very small and not many people are focusing there, but it is very important for the Dems to get this, and the Republicans need to keep it to themselves. However, you can't really tell from now. Everyone wants a piece of Long Island, and you just can't tell. We just have to wait until around 9 p.m. Eastern for us to know this is how the people of Long Island voted.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us from Kenya as our foreign correspondent on this race in New York. Have a great rest of your morning.
Thank you, Sophie, and have a good evening, and we cannot wait to see how this evening goes.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
I'm joined now by Richie Sarmiento. Richie, you've been closely watching the race for the House between Max Rose, the Democratic incumbent in this case, and Nicole Maliotakis, his Republican challenger. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sophie.
So, Maliotakis is running against Rose to represent the 11th District of New York. Can you give us some background about that district? Why is it considered one of the most competitive House races in the country?
So New York's 11th Congressional District, which includes Staten Island and parts of southern Brooklyn, has traditionally voted Republican until Max Rose, the Democrat, was elected in 2018. And the 11th District has been considered quite conservative district. It's also a counterweight to the rest of the city thanks to a number of overlapping demographic factors, including its base of white, blue-collar voters and a substantial contingent of active and retired New York City police officers and firefighters. After supporting former President Obama in 2008 and 2012, the district voted for President Trump in 2016 by about 10 percentage points. And then in 2017, Maliotakis ran for mayor of New York City, in which she lost to incumbent Mayor Bill de Blasio. However, she won 67% of the vote in the 11th district. And this is considered one of the most competitive House races in the country because it is New York City's only swing district.
So Nicole Malliotakis says she's selling herself as a law and order candidate. Can you tell us more about why is that important to her campaign?
So Malliotakis is being endorsed by many law enforcement unions in New York City. The district that she will be representing is a place where law and order candidates have historically done well. Max Rose defeated Republican Dan Donovan to flip the seat blue in 2018, and Malliotakis is aiming to flip it back by painting Rose as too liberal for the district. And she calls Rose law enforcement views as radically dangerous in an ad that implies he supports defunding the police. She held a conference a few months ago outside a senior citizen center to discuss the attack on a 89-year-old Asian woman who was slapped and lit on fire while walking on the street. And she showed this as a result of the increase of crime and mentioned that defunding the police is setting an example for perpetrators to commit crimes like that. And the last debate frequently came back to the issue of defunding the police, and Malliotakis used this to attack Rose.
This has definitely been a heated race, and the candidates have been mudslinging at each other and at Mayor Bill de Blasio. Can you tell me a little more about that?
So Mayor Bill de Blasio sort of became the punching bag for both candidates. Malliotakis blamed the increase of crime on the budget cut to the NYPD, and some residents resent de Blasio's handling of police reform and Black Lives Matter protests. Malliotakis also blamed him because he released criminals from Rikers Island, which serves as New York City's main jail complex. And so Malliotakis has tried to tie Rose to the mayor, describing the congressman as a radical liberal whose views are more in line with de Blasio's. But Rose also attacked the mayor, and he says that he doesn't support him despite that he's also a fellow Democrat.
And we're again a bit early in the evening for results, but what's your guess as to how this race will pan out?
It's really hard to say, but I won't be surprised if she won. I think she has a great advantage with many police unions on her side. And as I mentioned before, the 11th district is a place where law and order candidates have done well. And her campaign is all about law and order. The residents saw how the police reform was handled by Democratic leadership by the mayor, and they did not like the results. And so some residents are having doubts about Rose's leadership due to this issue. The 11th district is also a big supporter of Trump, and Malliotakis has Donald Trump endorsing her. A while back, Rose voted for impeachment of Trump, and Rose received a backlash due to this. So yeah, I won't be surprised if she won, but it's really, I don't know, it's hard to say.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Richie. It'll be interesting to see how this turns out. I'd like to welcome Chris Strong to the program to give us an update on the presidential election. Hey there, Chris.
Hello, great. Thank you so much, Sophie, for having me. We have finally made it to election night, and according to Elect Project, just over 100 million people voted early this election cycle, making the wait for results seem longer than ever for voters across the country. An estimated 50 to 60 million voters will add to that total before the counting has ceased. As of 7:30 p.m. Central Time, polls have fully closed in 26 states. 5 of these are key battleground states that we're going to look at tonight. In the Southeast, we have the big 3, and they don't play for the Miami Heat. Florida with 29 electoral votes, Georgia with 16, and North Carolina for 15. Up in the Rust Belt, 2 swing states have fully closed polls. Ohio with 18 electoral votes and the all-important Pennsylvania. And there are also partial closings of Michigan and my home state of Texas. So let's look at the Finnish projections. So far, NBC News has projected the results of 11 states and including also Washington, D.C. adding to that, totaling 93 electoral votes so far. So the first choice of the night for NBC News projected Donald Trump to win Indiana and its 11 electoral votes. This is no surprise here. Trump won by nearly 20% in 2016, so it's no surprise for the Trump campaign. Up next, NBC News projected Joe Biden to win Vermont and its 3 electoral votes. Those were the first 3 for the Biden campaign so far tonight. Once again, a textbook result so far into the results. NBC News then projected Donald Trump to win Kentucky and its 8 electoral votes. Another lock for either side of the political spectrum, Kentucky being a big red state. NBC News then projected Joe Biden to win Delaware, along with Maryland and Massachusetts all at the same time. This adds up to 24 electoral votes. They were able to announce this decision far before a lot of the expected vote came in, just because of how much of a blue state, basically a Biden lock, these states are. Along with that, Washington, D.C., which if you were to guess at home, it's actually the furthest leaning Democrat voters of any place in the United States. Hillary Clinton actually won by a margin of 80% in 2016. And so far, no votes have come in there, but it's already projected by NBC News to come in for Joe Biden.
So
Next up, oh, go ahead.
Can I just ask, so out of those 3 key states in the Southeast, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, do you think we can expect to see results tonight? Or are we really going to be waiting till tomorrow night to kind of, as they roll in?
Right, so those 3 states down in the Southeast are going to be the huge states tonight, as they really have their stuff together when it comes to counting mail-in ballots, which is the big important thing for this election, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Florida, so far, Trump is leading with 91% of votes in, 50.6% to 48.4%. So that's around a 225,000 vote lead for Trump in Florida. Also, as you said, looking at Georgia down in the Southeast, Georgia, Trump is currently leading 56.3% to 42.7%, with a total of only 23% of the votes in. Looking down at North Carolina, 66% of the votes are in, and Biden is currently leading 52.8% to 46.1%. So a bit of a hefty lead there for a swing state in North Carolina, but only 2/3 of the votes are in. So we're looking at all those key battleground states. I'm just going to finish the rest of the projections. Donald Trump is projected to win Oklahoma, Tennessee, as well as West Virginia. And right now, if you look at the race to 270, Donald Trump has 42 electoral votes and Joe Biden has 51. So a 9 electoral vote lead. But at the same time, no states have flipped from the 2016 results as of yet. And all of the states that have been projected are basically locks for either side. I would look for Florida with 91% of the votes in to be the next state to come in. And hopefully by our next half-hour update for you, some key battleground states are going to be confirmed by NBC News.
Thanks so much for that thorough update, Chris.
Great, thank you.
We're going next to a panel of 4 students from Dr. Place U.S. Security class. Activists, how they're playing.
Hello, I'm Ryan Dupelou, an analyst from Dr. Blaze's Political Science class, US and Global Security, where we study traditional and contemporary risks and threats. Nowadays, the ever-changing nature of politics broadens the field of security analysis to include more and more non-traditional types of threats. This discussion aims at giving some perspective regarding internal grievance groups and the levels of threat they pose to the health and functioning of the US democracy, especially in this time of election. Tonight, Emily Gillespie, Abigail Deweese, Kiki Holmes, and I will each present internal grievance groups whose very presence may have substantially shaped the voters' behaviors during the election. Our discussion revolves around two main questions. First, what is the internal grievance group we're each studying? Second, how does our issue fit into this year's presidential and congressional elections? So let's start the discussion. Emily, could you tell us what grievance group you're focusing on?
Yes, thank you, Ryan. Today, I will be introducing the risk of the white supremacist groups. White supremacist groups are far right-wing extremist groups motivated by harsh, radical, and bigoted views, as well as political views that back them. The Counter-Extremist Project, or the CEP, reported identities of 199 known white supremacist groups active within the US, which separate into two categories, namely National Socialists, aka neo-Nazis, and white ethno-nationalists. Both primarily seek to protect the white identity and culture from being destroyed by minorities and immigrants. Both neo-Nazis and white ethno-nationalists have been involved in hate crimes, and some of those violent. During COVID and protests, concerns of white supremacy have been increasing. Recently, the Department of Homeland Security's acting secretary, Chad Wolf, reported in a DHS report that white supremacist groups and organizations currently act as one of the most prominent domestic terrorist threats within the US. He further specifies their motives as seeking to force ideological change within the United States through tactics of violence, destruction, and protests.
Thank you, Emily. The internal grievance group I'm focusing on tonight is QAnon, and it wasn't initially a structured group. It's rather a super conspiracy theory, super in that it is similar to a magnet that attracts multiple other theories together. So everything started in 2017 on an online forum called 4chan, where Q presented himself as a fervent patriot working in the federal government. His main goal was to reveal the truth and help the people understand the political plots happening behind the scenes. And his main claim was that a pedophiliac and satanist cabal had infiltrated the US government. However, he or she, we don't know, also argued that President Trump was planning on launching a series of trials targeting leaders of the Democratic Party that would reveal this deep state cabal. In March 2019, the FBI field office of Phoenix, Arizona, declared QAnon-driven violent actions as threatening US domestic security because two individuals had committed crimes in the name of QAnon's so-called revelations about the deep state plot.
My topic discusses cybersecurity, more specifically how cyber recruitment of terrorist groups poses a threat. Cyber recruitment is a strategy used through social media platforms and other avenues in the cyber domain to generate a support or backing, as well as funding globally for such groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Their goal through this attack on the cyber domain is to target the idea of the Western world and democracy. This differs from what we see as a normal threat because it steers away from brute strength that we've seen in other terrorist attacks and targets the weaker parts of our national security. More specifically, today, 5G has caused even more worry considering the newer technological advancements, which gives space for a bigger threat from these groups.
Thank you, Kiki. So similar to Kiki's topic of the threat of cyber recruitment, the security of individuals and their way of life are put at risk due to the actions of militant leftist groups like Black nationalists, which I will talk to you about. So Black nationalism, it's a movement seeking greater self-determination for Black people. Black nationalist groups aren't nearly as prevalent as they used to be. Their heyday was kind of in the mid to late 90s, but a branch movement, Black separatism, has become more present today and could pose a threat to democratic processes if the 255 known Black separatist groups were to get organized enough to present a coherent, sustained source of pressure on the system. These separatists are more extreme than the greater umbrella group of Black nationalism and promote anti-white, anti-Semitic, anti-LGBTQ+, and male supremacist views, as well as seek the creation of a separate Black nation. So overall, their goal is to achieve more self-reliance through formal institutions similarly to Black nationalists. Interestingly though, while these Black interest groups seek more freedom, they have the potential to thwart the efforts of groups seeking equal treatment, as their sometimes aggressive approaches to protests can cast a negative light on other advocacy groups and provide justifications for those wanting to label them as a significant threat.
Thank you, Abigail. We're going to stick with the theme of suppression groups for a minute and talk about how they lead into the impact on the election or the risk of their impact on the election. And we're going to start back with the white supremacist groups. And starting with, or following back to Wolf's claim with the DHS, the Guardian reports on him, or on the DHS's claims, the Guardian reports that there are 13 right-wing extremists that have been arrested after the FBI learned of a plot to kidnap the Democratic governor of Michigan and a suspicion of another plot to kidnap the Virginia governor. Adding to the stirring of the activity of the white supremacist groups currently is remarks by President Trump. In his early debate with Biden, it's noted Trump replying sure to a number of times when asked to denounce white supremacist groups and the Proud Boys. His mistake came when telling them to stand down and stand by. The group on many facets, instead of standing down, took to voter intimidation as Trump continued to encourage a close eye at the polls. In an attempt to quell and address voter intimidation issues, the Human Rights Watch composed a request to Barr and the director of the FBI to address acknowledged issues of white supremacist groups and to solve and to protect voters in this coming election. The Human Rights Watch further states that their Department of Justice is planning to protect all peoples at polls from this threat through the election the best they can for the foreseeable future. Left unchecked, the suppression can go further. However, there are great efforts to come to better solvents for these issues. And we're going to move on to our next stressor.
Thank you, Emily. So the influence of QAnon is central to this year's presidential and congressional elections, especially since a dozen politicians running for Congress in November specifically mentioned or talked about QAnon in their rallies and meetings. And only a few weeks ago, Facebook decided to delete all the accounts related to QAnon's conspiracy theories. This decision is part of a larger process initiated by the biggest social media platforms to limit the spread of misinformation and fake news. Should President Trump not be re-elected, we may assume that QAnon's followers will consider that the deep state intentionally removed him from the Oval Office. A recent poll conducted by Civics, which is an online polling company, showed that 7% of Americans believe in or support QAnon's conspiracy theories. Clearly, the proportion of American people who trust QAnon is therefore very low. And in this time of election, we may read or hear a lot of news that focus on QAnon, but in reality, the phenomenon remains quite marginal. Is it a reason to ignore the ever-growing distrust with regard to traditional media and politics? Of course not. Developing media literacy, explaining the functioning of algorithms, and insisting on the need to compare multiple sources of information would undeniably be a good way to limit the spread of such conspiracy theories.
In connection to the 2020 election, it's hard to say exactly where the threat of cyber recruitment for the transnational terrorist group lies, given that human security is so different for every individual. There are things getting done to have general security in the cyber domain, such as October being Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which the White House has sent out a proclamation on October 1st and has since been working to ensure cybersecurity. And they talked a lot about 5G and the power of it and how they are trying to work around and try to figure out a way that overlaps and has security for every individual at every level. But again, it's difficult because of the technological advancements within 5G and the power that other groups and other nations do have within the cyber domain. Other than that, more specifically for the election, voters are worried about less about like the terrorist groups and more about other nations tampering or attacking through the cyber sphere, specifically countries like Russia and China and Iran, which the DHS put out in one of their reports this year. They seem to pose a larger threat to the cybersecurity of the election rather than the transnational terrorist groups.
So groups of Black nationalists and Black separatists are known as militaristic movements, but they are not currently organized enough to present significant pressure to the system. However, should these groups amass more power and react more fiercely, they would pose a physical threat to the public, and other members of the public will start generalizing and stereotyping, which could lead them to believe that all Black advocacy groups are reactionary and violent. So ironically, such a social reaction could endanger the goals of groups that advocate fair and democratic change, and these groups represent a much greater percentage of the US population. According to the Wall Street Journal, the FBI started labeling Black interest groups as Black identity extremists in 2017 and sought to categorize them as a domestic terrorist threat. They have since changed that title to racially motivated violent extremism, but the initiative nevertheless has led to the virtual dismissal of right-wing actions and exaggeration of leftist group movements, which has also created repercussions for minority groups and ignored the more aggressive plans of right-wing groups, such as armed white supremacists showing up at polling locations. Additionally, the labeling of groups as terrorist organizations could generate much more fear and potentially lead to infringements on personal rights and freedoms of all people. Examples would be over-policing or invasion of individual privacy. So that was our presentation on sub-state and international grievance groups. Thank you all so much for listening and for your time. Have a wonderful night.
Another student panel is joining us now, this time from the Pulpit and Politics FYE class, taught by Dr. Brian Roberts. They'll be discussing partisan leanings of religious traditions in the US, with a special look at why exactly adherents of various traditions hold these partisan leanings.
Today we will be diving into religious groups and their party affiliations. I'm Vi, and I am joined by Nick, Sam, and Daniel. I'm going to give you guys a brief overview of a couple of religious groups and their party affiliations, and then we're going to dive into a couple of these groups with more specifics and details to give you guys a brief overview of these relationships. So to start off, some of the groups that are more Republican historically, that includes white evangelical Protestants and Mormons. And then on the other side of the spectrum, some groups that are more Democratic leaning include the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the National Baptist Convention, Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims, atheists and agnostics, Jews, and Unitarian Universalists. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to share with you a little bit about what religious tradition they've been focusing on and what political party that group leans towards and how that's been impacted by the group's core beliefs and values. So Nick, can you start us off?
Yeah, so I focused on the Jewish religion and the majority of Jewish people tend to lean towards the Democratic side. Some of the values that they hold and what's gotten them to lead that way is first, Jews are liberals that celebrate Enlightenment ideas. They've been pretty consistent about focusing on finding new ways to improve their religion group. Some of the things that they've done is, well, first they're pretty accepting and supportive people. They basically supported everyone's lives, such as LGBTQ and also minorities. So then those are some of the reasons why they lean towards the Democratic side.
Nice. Oh, I can keep going. Well, I focus more on Catholics. Catholics are now considered more central leaning, have a central political views since 1960. Even though they tend to vote for Democratic parties more often. Also, we have to have in mind that Catholics are divided between white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics. which tend to play a really big role in their decision making.
Yeah,
Nice.
really good point. Daniel, can you tell us about your group?
Yes, so I've been focusing on the white evangelical Protestants. So the white evangelical Protestants are Christians and they study the Bible. So the white evangelical Protestants are very Republican leaning. So during the presidential campaign 4 years ago, they were mostly supporting Trump as he is a Republican. So we can see that in the different ethnics, in the different Protestants with different ethnics, we can see that they don't all lean Republican because they don't all share the same ideas. So we can see that some are leaning Democrats sometimes, and we can see that Trump supports to the white evangelical Protestants because they share the same opinions on some beliefs, so like anti-gay marriage, anti-abortion, and recently anti-mask protests. So they share a lot of common ideas.
That's a really good point. It's really interesting to see also how race plays a role within these religious traditions even. So Daniel talked to us a little bit about white evangelical Protestants. But on the other hand, Black Protestants tend to be, while they also follow those really strict biblical traditions and those ideas, they also tend to lean a little bit more democratic, and the reason for that is because of their ethnic ties and how the Democratic Party has been in the past much more supportive of racial and ethnic movements and equality than the Republican Party in the past, and sometimes those ties are stronger than religious ties. Sam, I know you talked a little bit earlier about the difference between white and Hispanic Catholics. Do you think you could expand on that and how ethnicity and race plays into your religious tradition?
Yes, of course. Well, white Catholics tend to be attend more to church services. This ends up on having more of a conservative ideology, which tends to be Republicans. So that's why they think the Republican is the best option for them. While Hispanic Catholics are mostly immigrants, so they tend to go for the more liberal candidate these days. That happened last election, for example, with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Most minorities voted for Donald Trump, thanks to the immigrant speech from the Trump administration.
Cool. Nick, would you talk a little bit about splits and differences within the Jewish religious tradition and faith?
Yeah, yeah. So there's two different types of groups of Jews. There's the Orthodox Jews and also the Reform Jews. The Orthodox kind of tend to lean more towards the Republican side. The reason for that is because they have more traditional values and that they follow strict Mosaic laws, and they find this to be really important to them. As for the Reform Jews, they lean more towards the Democratic side. The reason for those is because they focus on moral teachings and that they have more progressive beliefs to the Democratic Party. But all in all, the majority is that Jews lean more towards the Democratic side. That's the majority. So yeah, that's
right. And that's interesting how those traditional values again are seen coming up, where people who really hold those traditional values tend to be more in favor of the Republican Party. Do you guys think you could tell me a little bit about how your group's political influence and affiliations have changed over time and developed?
Yeah, I could start off. So Over time, 2007, 66% of Jews leaned more towards the Democratic side, 24% leaned more towards the Republican, and then there was a 10% that were independent. And if we look at towards now, for the most recent, there was 49% leaning more towards the Democratic side, 18% were leaning towards Republican, and then there was about 20% that were left as independent. So there was just an increase of the percentage that became independent, and then also there was a big difference in the percentage of the Democratic side. So overall, that was the change in time.
Right, it's interesting to see how that shifts. Sam, could you talk to us about Catholics and how those things have developed?
Yeah, of course. Well, as I said before, nowadays they are more central, but tend to be more democratic. Even though this coming elections, about 59% of white Catholics tend to be voting for Donald Trump, while 65% of Hispanic Catholics tend to be more leaning towards Biden, which just makes you understand that minorities can tend to be more democratic in a way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know that another interesting trend that we've seen recently is younger generations tending more towards the Democratic Party and tending more towards more liberal ideologies and views. And that's really interesting to see that, you know, over multiple religious traditions and see that trend keep up.
Yeah.
Daniel, would you like to tell us anything?
Yeah, I can share something about the white evangelical Protestants.
Yeah.
So, for example, they are anti-gay marriage. So we can see that 43% of the new generation accepts more generally gay marriage compared to 19% of the older generations who only accept gay marriage. So there's a big difference between the newer generations and the older generations with their ideologies.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's a really good point. Do any of you guys have anything else you'd like to add about what you've seen in terms of how religious traditions have been involved with politics and political affiliations?
I think that's all for me.
All right. Thank you guys all so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us today on this segment. We really hope that we have helped to deepen your understanding of the relationship between religious affiliation and partisan ties. Now I'm going to hand it back to the Print at the Polls anchor, and we'll see you all next year. Thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
And my name actually is Harvey Kronberg.
And that's it for the first hour of tonight's coverage. We've received updates on races around the country and on issues expected to impact the election this year. It's a bit early to call many states, and votes are still rolling in, so thanks for joining us so far, and make sure to stay tuned for updates and analysis coming up right after this short break.
Welcome to everyone tuning in as we roll into hour 2 of tonight's Print at the Polls broadcast. I'm Delaney Gatine, and I'm excited to be anchoring for the next hour of our program. We have some more great content lined up for you all during this hour. We'll hear from students in the Women in Politics class who are tracking some of the most important House and Senate races around the country, as well as some students both in the Pulpit and Politics FYE class and the U.S. and Global Security classes. And of course, we'll be providing updates on the presidential race. But right now, I would like to welcome the special guest, Harvey Kronberg. Harvey is the current editor and publisher of the Quorum Report, an online nonpartisan newsletter focusing on Texas politics and government. In his over 30 years covering Texas politics, Harvey has been cited in diverse publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Congressional Quarterly. And he serves as a political commentator for Time Warner Cable News in Central Texas. We are blessed to have him join us here tonight. Hi, Harvey.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good, excellent.
Thank you for.
I'm on somebody else's computer where a group of us are watching computer numbers rolling in. So, and this is a better computer than the one I have. So.
No worries. Harvey, Texas has historically voted Republican, with the last Democratic candidate to win its general election having been President Jimmy Carter in 1976. This election, it has been deemed a state to watch, with many claiming it will be a toss-up between Biden and Trump for those 38 delegates. Why do you think Texan voters are viewed as somewhat unpredictable this year?
Well, first of all, there's a couple of things. One is obviously we're more ethnically diverse than we've ever been before, and that's not just Latino, that is Asian, that is Middle Eastern, so the conversation is such that we're not a homogeneous society. In fact, Houston and Harris County probably is the most diverse community in the country. Second, this is after Beto O'Rourke in the last election demonstrated that out of 8 million voters, he lost only by 200,000 to Ted Cruz. It demonstrated that there was a Democratic constituency here. Third, the Democratic coalition, the folks that typically vote Democratic, are women, minorities, millennials, and typically they are more responsive to marquee names at the top of the ticket, celebrity names at the top of the ticket, and we have no shortage of celebrity names at the top of the ticket. We have more white female candidates at the top of the ticket this time, and that has spoken to a much broader audience than we've seen before. And finally, I would add that because Texas looks viable, or had to look viable, the Democratic Party has been starved for money now for 20 years. Its primary contributors have been essentially trial plaintiffs' attorneys, which is antithetical to the business community and very easy to demonize. This time, money is pouring in from all over. The Democrats have never had so much money to be able to promote a message. All of those things conspire to create a circumstance where Democrats are more viable than they've ever been before. And I guess one last thing I should add is that we are at the end of a redistricting cycle. Redistricting is done in order to create districts where a Democrat can only beat a Democrat or a Republican can only beat a Republican. Typically, that tends to degrade over the course of the decade. And so we now have a circumstance where we're at the end of the decade and districts that were drawn to be Democratic are now mixed. Districts that were drawn to be Republican are now mixed. So those all conspire to create a circumstance where Democrats have a much better possibility and a broader message to be able to sell, and a broader constituency to sell it to.
Right, right. Now, what would you say that each of the candidates has done to secure votes in Texas? And out of the two, Trump and Biden, who do you believe has been the most effective in doing that and establishing their support?
Well, you have to, presumptively, this is a Trump state. But the core of the Republican base vote is typically in the suburbs and typically in rural Texas. Well, the suburbs in the last election with Beto O'Rourke at the top of the ticket, 5 of the 7 suburban counties those 7 counties have been rock-ribbed Republican forever. 5 of those counties essentially flipped. In some cases, like Fort Bend County, Your folks may not even remember who Tom DeLay is, but he was a very hard-nosed Republican majority leader in Congress. His district beat, not his district, his county, Fort Bend County outside of Houston, essentially beat every Republican that was running countywide in the last election. And so the savings account that's left for Republicans at this point is predominantly rural Texas. Now, Joe Biden was not active in Texas. He spent a lot of money here for commercials, but the infrastructure is it's still far more Republican than it is Democratic.
Right. Wow. Now, so Joe Biden did win the Democratic primary in Texas and 34.5% of the vote. And with that influx in Democratic support in Texas, how do you think that those primary results will play into the election?
Well, at the moment, as we're watching the results come in, we've had an enormous early vote in Texas, which has cannibalized the vote at the end of the cycle, actually on election day. With the exception of Houston, I think that we're not seeing the kind of numbers at the end of the 3 weeks of voting that we saw at the beginning. What traditionally happens is that Democrats vote very, very heavily at the beginning of the early vote cycle, taper off, and then it goes Republican. And at least at this moment, that is what looks like is what is happening. The Democrats were positioned to be able to take the control of the House. It's a 150-member Texas House, so they need 76. And at the moment, if you had to guess, the Republicans will, out of the 76 you need for the majority, it looks like the Republicans may get the 76 or 77. But that's a functional tie as far as the Texas legislature is concerned, and it's hard to claim victory for a party that technically loses. That puts them at the table for almost everything but redistricting.
Right. Well, we will be sure to be checking in on those results throughout the night because that is such a close and highly important race this election. Thank you, Harvey. That is all the time we have tonight, but we are very grateful to have you to start off the second hour of our broadcast. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Now we will hear from our first of the students in the Women in Politics class this hour, who also happens to be the anchor of last hour, Sophie Hills. Hi, Sophie.
Hey, Delaney.
All right. Now, Sophie is covering the race in Virginia's 10th congressional district between Democrat Abigail Spanberger and Republican Nick Freitas. Sophie, polls show that this is a close race and is especially interesting since it involves an incumbent Democrat in what has traditionally been a red district. Can you tell us a little bit more about the dynamics surrounding that?
Yeah, so Spanberger was elected in 2018, and she was the first Democrat to win the 7th congressional district since 1968, so exactly 50 years. And she also was elected by a district that went to Trump in 2016. And additionally, the president has endorsed Freitas, Spanberger's challenger, and Spanberger, also complicating things further, she voted for the president's impeachment early this year, which did create kind of some disgruntlement within her district, and that's something that Freitas has worked to capitalize on as he campaigns against her. But nonetheless, she really does have high approval ratings because she focuses on issues that her constituents really care about. Very plainly, healthcare and broadband internet access. And she really champions those two things. And her constituents seem to really appreciate that and trust her to continue carrying their interests forward.
And with that, Spanberger is known to emphasize the national good over partisan politics. So what in her background inspires that? And how has she demonstrated that during her time in office?
She is interesting because she doesn't have a traditional pathway into politics. She started out as a federal agent investigating narcotics cases. Then she moved to the CIA, where she was a case officer in the US and abroad. And she got a dual degree from a university in the US and a university in Germany. And so she speaks Spanish. She has a very she has a very international perspective, but then she kind of pairs that and that strong sense of serving her country, through her many years in the CIA, and then she went from the CIA very briefly through the private sector and then landed in politics. So she, strongly identifies with serving her country. She also has this very international experience, and those two that seems to broaden her view rather than making her fixate on just her own party. And so, in a sense, she kind of has a law and order background. It helps her appeal to Republicans and maybe more right-leaning Democrats. But she also just has a reputation for working across the aisle on issues that some Democrats and Republicans may not, like immigration. And so she really has proven her interest in wide issues, and then also her dedication to serving her very specific district.
And in what ways does her challenger appeal to voters that Spanberg doesn't?
He has been in local politics for a while. He's in the Virginia House of Delegates right now, but he's not a by-the-book Republican. He has kind of a free market, hands-off approach to government, and it leans more towards libertarianism often. And he places a lot of emphasis on his background in the military, which he tries to distinguish from Spanberger's background as a federal agent. But I think the biggest thing is the president's support. This district went to Trump in 2016. Trump endorsed Freitas, and that goes a long way, it seems.
All right. And the state of Virginia was called by Associated Press for Biden early in the night. So what can you tell us about the vote totals in the 10th Congressional District for this race?
Well, it's still a little early. It's only 43% reporting. And of that, 60% is going to Freitas currently and 40% to Spanberger. But it's only 43% in, and I don't think that's a very reliable indication, just because it doesn't account for mail-in ballots. This is coming from CNN, the results, and CNN also classifies this race as tilting Democratic, which has been what it's been classified as all along. And Spanberger does poll well with her constituents, so it is, I think, too early to tell.
Well, thank you for that insight, Sophie, and we'll look forward to seeing how that race unfolds.
Thanks so much.
Our next interview tonight is with Laura Mayo, who is covering the race in Pennsylvania's 1st District between Republican Brian Fitzpatrick and Democrat Christina Finello. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Laura, could you tell us about Pennsylvania redistricting maps adopted in 2018 due to illegal partisan gerrymandering?
Yeah, so in 2016, new redistricting maps were established in Pennsylvania because the others were found to have an illegal partisan gerrymandering. So that means that this 1st congressional district that I'm following has never been seen before in a presidential or House and Senate election.
Also a completely new district. And following that question, this election in Pennsylvania's House District 1 between Republican incumbent Brian Fitzpatrick and Democrat Christina Finello is unique in that Hillary Clinton would have carried this district in 2016, yet it elected a Republican, Fitzpatrick, to represent it in Congress. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so in 2018, with the new redistricted District 1, Brian Fitzpatrick was represented as a Republican to represent this district in the House. But in the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton won for this district as president. So this is it's a district where there's a Republican representing them in the House, but they're majority Democrat. So that would be interesting to see what happens in this election. And that's only one of 5 districts in the nation that has this same situation.
And I understand that outside spending has had a notable impact on this race as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So outside spending by super PACs has had a substantial effect on this election. So $3 million has been spent in opposition to female Democrat Finello, and only half of that has been spent in opposition to her opponent, the incumbent Brian Fitzpatrick. And additionally, Fitzpatrick has had a support of $2 million in outside spending, while Christina Finello has had only about 50,000. So that's like a lot of money that's been spent in opposition to her.
Okay, and as vote totals in Pennsylvania come in with polls just closing at the beginning of this hour, what can you tell us about the current vote totals in this race?
Yeah, so currently, only the latest I was able to see was only 1% of the election results have come in, but Finello is leading with 72% of the vote. But it will be difficult to call because half of Pennsylvania is voting by absentee mail-in ballot, and there isn't enough time to count all those before and report them all. And also, additionally, the people who vote with the mail-in ballot tend to be more Democrat, so there might be a lean towards Republican early on, but that may shift to Democrat later.
Right, so with that 1% voting in now, we will be looking forward to how that race unfolds later in the night. Thank you, Laura, and I look forward to seeing how that pans out. Now, we will be hearing from students in the U.S. and Global Security class about stresses on the United States electorate.
Hi, my name is Emmett Wainwright, and I am part of the U.S. and Global Securities class led by Dr. Julie Blaze, in which we study traditional and contemporary risks and threats. Noah Stewart, Jake Smith, and I have focused our research on sources of stress on voters emanating from domestic U.S. politics and society. The field of security studies' consideration of internal security threats has evolved since the end of the Cold War, and even more so since 9/11. Jake took a closer look at the changes 9/11 brought to civil liberties in the U.S. and how increased domestic surveillance can be a subtle source of stress. Could you tell us more about what you found out, Jake?
Sure thing, Emmett. Well, 9/11 was the first major attack by a non-state entity against the United States. In the wake of the attacks, a new major security threat emerged from within our own institutions. The non-state actor of al-Qaeda was a clear security threat. However, there was no clear territorial enemy. We weren't really equipped to respond to this non-traditional threat. The use of surveillance grew as a strategy to fight terrorism. The United States expanded its existing structures. However, this surveillance came at a cost. While the United States may have believed the surveillance of phone calls and internet data would ensure the security of Americans, programs that were started in the wake of 9/11 were seen by many as invasive and overreaching. Most Americans eventually found out how overreaching these programs were in 2013. 12 years after the 9/11 attacks, Edward Snowden leaked the details of an NSA surveillance program in which the personal data, phone calls, and ultimately the security of the American people's data had been given freely to the state. This puts Americans in a rough spot. How do you act when you know you're being monitored and judged by a faceless state, an unknown watcher at any moment? The state's duty is to provide for its citizens, not to monitor and control them. In the NSA's surveillance program, it clearly crossed this line. It's not always clear to citizens if there's enough oversight or accountability or transparency, all parts of a democratic government that seem less and less certain across the last 2 decades.
Thanks for sharing your insights with Jake. Aside from a right to privacy, another key civil liberty in the US is freedom of expression. However, it seems like that freedom is increasingly being used to spread false information. Emmett took a look at how the rise of misinformation can act as a source of stress and arguably as a threat to security. What did you find out, Emmett?
Thanks, Noah. As citizens in a democracy, we need access to reliable information to make decisions. Therefore, this rise of misinformation, also called truth decay, is cause for concern. Truth decay, as coined by the Rand Corporation, is where there is growing disagreement over information that would normally be accepted as fact. Truth decay can be caused by a variety of factors, including influence by another country or internal group, or systemic changes to the way we get our information. One of the main influences on misinformation is due to the changes to the way information is spread. The internet and social media have lowered the barrier to being able to share opinions or statements that are claimed as fact, and have eroded the standards of information reliability that once existed. Many platforms online allow anyone to pass information off as fact, while encouraging short, sensationalized opinions, either through character limits, like with Twitter, or the structure of the algorithm that recommends you the next video, like with YouTube. That structure, combined with the option for anonymity, discourages accountability and rational debate. Furthermore, many of these platforms analyze your internet activity, such as your social networks or your search or view history, to decide what to show you next. This can be beneficial to you if you want to search for more YouTube videos about your hobbies, want to find more of your friends on Facebook, or want to follow more celebrities on Twitter from a show you like. This becomes an issue, however, when your political views influence your recommendation, and thus shape the view of the world you see through the internet. Another significant influence on misinformation is due to targeted misinformation campaigns by other countries or by internal groups. These misinformation campaigns prey upon political differences to sow discord between opposing groups, and internet advertising allows them to more effectively target their desired audience.
Thanks for that summary, Emmett. Stress about information is not the only issue that is testing our democratic institutions at the moment. As we are all aware, COVID-19 has presented significant challenges to governments around the world. NOAA took a closer look at the risks COVID-19 presents in the United States. Tell us more about what you discovered, Noah.
SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus that caused COVID-19, is the virus that scientists have long warned us of. The first recorded case in the United States was reported January 20th in Washington State. 8 months later, the country has suffered severely from the pandemic. In the public health area, the New York Times reports over 8 million total cases and 200,000 total deaths in the United States. Concerning the economy, the World Bank expects a global GDP to contract by 5.2% in a baseline forecast. For the United States, the Visual Capitalist reports that the country's quarterly GDP dropped by 9.5% in the second quarter, with 50 million people out of the US workforce. When we look at congressional spending, COVID-19 is also a significant stressor on the government budget, as it has already exceeded spending for the Iraq, Vietnam, Korean, First World War, and Civil War combined. As you can imagine, these numbers have presented a challenge for both US policymakers and citizens. My current research is focused on the long-term impacts the pandemic might have on US foreign policy, specifically concerning the United States' leadership role in international relations. What I have found so far is that the United States' position as a global leader is decreasing due to its uncoordinated response to the pandemic, which caused extreme economic damage and brought many other internal issues to the surface, such as racial inequality and other socioeconomic disparities within the population.
Those are some impressive and important numbers and insights. To be honest, they're a bit stressful, especially considering the upcoming election. But this can't be the first time that the public has been faced with this kind of stress during an election. Jake, what did the 2004 presidential election look like, and how did 9/11 impact that federal election?
So 9/11 had an immediate impact on the federal election, as Bush saw his approval ratings spike 39% overnight following the attacks. While this approval boost slowly deteriorated over the next few years, Bush still had more than enough support to win the presidency a second time in 2004. Additionally, Republicans saw gains in both the House and the Senate in 2004, likely off of the coattails of the strong showing for the president. These gains, however, were an initial reaction to a dramatic event. Claims that Iraq possessed nuclear weapons served to leverage people's Cold War-era fears and garnered unsustainable support for the war. In fact, polls at the time showed that 64% of Americans did not want war with Iraq and preferred negotiations instead. Claims that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction were never substantiated, and we continue to feel the stress caused by the conflict even today.
Those are some amazing points you made, Jake. It is very interesting that in President Bush's case, the way information was used after 9/11 and into the invasion of Iraq played into his favor. However, I feel like the role and nature of misinformation has changed since then. Emmett, how has misinformation been influencing more recent elections, and how might that be stressing voters more than usual?
Thanks, Noah. According to a poll by the Pew Research Center, about 1 in 5 Americans now get their political and election news through social media. and those who do are significantly less likely to be knowledgeable about common objective facts about the US political process or the overall state of the country. Of US adults who get their information primarily from social media, only about 43% could answer half or more of the poll's questionnaire correctly, as opposed to groups who got their information from cable or network TV, print, radio, or a news website, of which 64% of those could answer half or more of the questions correctly. There is definitive evidence that Russia interfered in the US presidential election as well, damaging public confidence in the election process and deepening political divisions. There is also evidence that this continues in the 2020 election, including targeted advertisements and false social media accounts designed to influence specific voter blocs. This influence can cause uncertainty and instabilities in democracies like the United States, both internally and externally. If democratic structures within a country degrade, this could negate the benefit of democracy to a more peaceful world order, creating more threats for democratic countries and classifying disinformation and misinformation as security threats to all other democracies as well. Instability in the United States can impact all others across the world, and that can be a stressful thing to think about.
Thanks for your thoughts on that, Emmett. Thinking back to the numbers Noah told us about earlier surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure they constitute a significant cause of stress for voters in this year's election. For example, the pandemic has already had a significant effect on how the debates have taken place this year. How has misinformation surrounding COVID-19 influenced this year's election and stressed voters in other ways, Noah?
Thanks for the question, Jake. Misinformation surrounding COVID-19 will likely impact the 2020 presidential election in two ways. Firstly, the Trump administration's response to COVID-19 has been a significant talking point in the election. According to Pew Research Center, 62% of voters say that the coronavirus outbreak is very important to their vote in the 2020 presidential election, coming in fourth after the economy, healthcare, and Supreme Court appointments. One of Joe Biden's main criticisms of Donald Trump has been his handling of the COVID-19 crisis. He blames the lackluster response presented by the Trump administrations for many infections and deaths in the country. President Trump, on the other hand, blames China for failing to report the danger of the virus far enough in advance. This blame game is reinforced by the second way misinformation surrounding COVID-19 will impact the election, which is the contradictory facts that both candidates have spread concerning the pandemic. On the one hand, President Trump has publicly questioned the science behind many COVID-19 related measures, such as wearing masks, the treatment with certain drugs, and social distancing. On the other hand, Joe Biden has voiced his disagreement with the current COVID-19 response, expressing his support for a national mask mandate during his speech at the Democratic National Convention in August. These developments have created a situation in which scientific facts are up for debate and in fact up for election. Obviously, both of these factors cause a great amount of stress for voters. Not only is the electorate highly polarized along party lines, but the circumstances surrounding the election are unprecedented. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, mail-in ballots have seen a surge in popularity. Even though President Trump has publicly questioned their reliability, they will constitute a significant share of ballots this year. That means we most likely will not know for sure who will win the election by tonight. These circumstances, together with the fear of disruption at polling stations on election day, will make this election a stressful time for many voters. I wish I could share some easy solutions to these issues that I can implement myself, but increasingly I find myself at a loss. Do you guys have any good ideas?
COVID has clearly increased stress surrounding misinformation and reliable news, but luckily there are a few things you can do to ensure you're getting closer to the truth. It's important to be critical of the information you receive in the news and social media. It's not a perfect solution, but I'd say just try to get your facts from a variety of sources.
You're right, Jake. It's important to rely on many sources, especially with the recent increase in dramatized and opinionated news. We also shouldn't be afraid to question our own views and be willing to have open-minded debates with those of the other side.
Now that we know more about some of the issues that will add stress to voters this election and a possible way to cope with it, we can only hope everything runs smoothly and no one gets too stressed with all these added complications.
Maybe they should give out free face masks as a reward for voting at the polling stations. Then everyone can go home and relax as the results come in.
I'm sure you mean the skincare type, not the COVID ones, right, Jake?
Yes, I, for one, could go for a cleansing charcoal scrub.
I'd be down to join you, Jake. Socially distanced, of course. Thank you for listening to our short presentation. We hope you all have a stress-free election night.
Thank you to to the U.S. and Global Security class for that information about stresses on the U.S. electorate. This hour is moving quickly, but we still have plenty to cover before the night is over. Before we get into more live interviews, we'll hear a live election update from Chris Strong. Take it away, Chris.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Delaney. Since our last election update at 7:30, an additional 14 states have fully closed their polls. 5 of them, Texas, Arizona in the south, and Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin up in the north, being key swing states. 40 states and 10 out of 13 battleground states are now fully closed. According to NBC News, 7 states were projected to win for either side, 5 of them going to Trump, and none of them being surprises. Arkansas and their 6 electoral votes going to the Trump campaign, as well as North Dakota, South Dakota, Alabama, and South Carolina. Those add up to 30 extra electoral votes since our last time talking, and now Trump has a total of 63. On the Biden side of things, no shockers either. Biden takes New York with 29 electoral votes, as well as Colorado with only 32% of the votes in, with 9 electoral votes. He now has 89 compared to Trump's 63. So quickly here, we're going to look into the battleground states, as none of the 13 have been decided yet. Well, one of them is very close. Florida, down in the southeast, 93% are in, and Trump is currently leading by 3%, 51% to 48%. And if you look at certain counties in the state, Pinellas County usually picks who's going to win. They seem to be kind of a teller county. However, they voted with 92% in currently, they voted 0.2% over for Biden so far. Now let's look at North Carolina, which is actually one of the more surprising results of the battleground states so far. North Carolina, Biden is currently leading by 1.8% with 80% in. And if you look at the states, one of the main counties that we focus on in North Carolina is Robeson. And Trump is actually taking Robeson by 17% so far. So maybe that isn't as much of a teller this time around as it usually is. Now let's look at Ohio. Ohio has 62% in and is currently going to Joe Biden. That is another state that in the polls was slightly favored to Trump before the election. So it could be another shocker victory for Joe Biden, but only 62% of the votes are in. And we have 2 more to talk about. Let's talk about my home state of Texas, where Joe Biden is currently losing by 0.2% with 73% in. My home county as well, Collin County, usually is one of the biggest tellers in the election for Texas, being Republican every year. And Joe Biden only has a 2% deficit in the state of Texas. Finally, let's look at Georgia. Georgia, only 44% of the votes are in. However, Donald Trump is leading by 14%. If you look at the map, the reason for this is major states that are mainly Democrat voters, like Atlanta's county, only have 0.2% of the votes in. So look for this to evolve in the next 30 minutes before our next update. That's all I have for you for now.
Now, Chris, to go back to Texas really quickly, we've been seeing it flip back and forth a little bit as votes come in. And a historically Republican state, what would that mean for Biden to win Texas?
It would mean that basically the night is over if Biden were to win Texas. Trump did take Florida, which is huge for him, 29 electoral votes, but the 38 electoral votes of Texas is just so huge in an election. And if Biden were to be able to somehow take Texas, which it's pretty close right now, that would be close to the night for Donald Trump going to the Biden campaign.
Well, we'll definitely have to keep everyone posted with the results of that Texas election. Thank you for the update, Chris.
Thank you.
Now, we'll move right into some more live interviews with the Women in Politics class. With me now, I have Kelsey Bettman, who has been looking closely at the race in South Carolina's 1st congressional district between Democrat Joe Cunningham and Republican Nancy Mace. So, Kelsey, I understand that Nancy Mace worked for the Trump campaign in 2016. Based upon the dynamics of the presidential election, do you think that this factor could potentially win or lose her votes?
That's a really, really good question. Nancy has been very open about the fact that she did work for the Trump campaign in 2016. As a matter of fact, she's actually been pushing it, and it is something that is both on her website and something that she has talked about during while she was talking to people and doing interviews with everybody. It does not appear to be hurting her. As a matter of fact, she's kind of using it to gain votes, as South Carolina did go to Trump in the 2016 election. So that seems to be a positive aspect to her campaign.
And it seems that environmental issues have been a subject of debate during this campaign. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 1st District of South Carolina is all across the coast, and offshore drilling is a very large subject. A matter of fact, this is a subject that both Joe and Nancy can agree on, that they do not agree with offshore drilling. Nancy has been very vocal about the fact that while she does support Trump, she does not support that he does support offshore drilling. So she has been very good about pushing back on that. And as far as Joe goes, while he was in office, he was able to get something passed in order to keep offshore drilling from happening. So they are both very on the same front as far as that goes. As far as other environmental issues go, that is where they start changing dramatically, as Joe is constantly bringing up the fact that Nancy has denied climate change and so forth and so on. So at least they have the same idea going with offshore drilling.
And looking into campaign finance in this election, has there been anything significant surrounding the money side of both of these campaigns?
Yeah, it was very interesting in this last little bit of the race. Nancy did come out on top with raising more money than Joe, but overall, looking at both campaigns, Joe did raise more money, actually a record amount that has been raised in a South Carolina campaign before. So that is very cool for both of them, but Joe did end up coming out on top.
And with this election, a lack of professionalism seems to be surrounding the presidential candidates and other Senate elections. Had these candidates done well with keeping their professional hats on during the election?
You know what? That is a very good and relevant question. They have done a pretty good job for the most part. Where it got a little shaky was their debate in September, where they both ended up ignoring the mediator for about 15 minutes and just going at each other about things that they felt like talking about. So there has been a little bit of lack of professionalism, but for the most part, they have kept it pretty professional on both sides.
Well, that debate instance is an interesting parallel to our presidential debates. Now, Kelsey, South Carolina polls are closed and votes are actively being counted. Associated Press has called it for Trump at this point. And what can you tell us about the current status of the election in South Carolina's 1st congressional district?
So looking at it in the 1st congressional district, as of right now, it does look like Joe is leading with 51.6% and Nancy not far behind with 48.4%. However, there's only been 19% reporting. So we still have a long night to go and we'll see what happens between them.
Well, thank you for those insights, Kelsey. We'll now be hearing from one of Kelsey's classmates in the Women in Politics class, Erin Demery. Erin is covering the race in Michigan's 3rd congressional district between Democrat Hillary Scholten and Republican Peter Meyer. Hi, Erin.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going well. This race is for an open seat, correct? And can you tell us what that means for the candidates?
Absolutely. Neither candidate is the incumbent. They are both running on equal footing. So in fact, this race is considered a toss-up. There is no clear predicted winner here. The current seat holder is Justin Amash, who's a Republican turned independent, and he is a critic of President Trump and has decided to retire at the end of this term. Amash's path shows how ideologically split Michigan is, and especially their 3rd district. This creates the ideal environment for a race like this one with no incumbent and no clear ideological lead in the district. And it's the perfect race for candidates with no prior political experience. Hillary Scholten was a lawyer and Peter Meyer was in the military, and neither have served in elected positions before. So they are very different personal backgrounds, and I'm excited to see how this race is decided at the end of the night.
So with these newly political candidates, I hear that campaign finance of these candidates can tell us a lot about what is going on in the district. Could you tell us a little bit more about campaign finance for this particular election?
Absolutely. Hillary Scholten has high out-of-state funding. She's received $1.3 million from outside of Michigan. Meyer has low out-of-state funding with only about $160,000 sourced from outside of Michigan. And the difference in these numbers can partly be explained by Meyer's personal funding and the funding he's received from Meyer Incorporated, which is the massive grocery chain that has made his family billions of dollars. So the outside spending for this race is also very interesting for both candidates, because both candidates have received roughly $2 million spent against them in various forms of ads. And Scholten has only received $26,000 spent in her support, while Meyer has had $340,000 spent in his favor. So there's another big difference there. Another major way that finances can explain this district is with PACs. Scholten has high ideological and single issue support, as well as support from labor unions, however, she has low levels of support from business and industry. Meyer is the opposite. He has much lower level single issue support and none from labor unions, but he has high levels of support from businesses. As you can see, there are some very interesting factors in this race.
And how does the race in this district compare to Michigan as a whole? Michigan is a swing state, as we know. Does this race have broader implications?
Absolutely. As I've said, Michigan is ideologically evenly split. So if Hillary Scholten wins Michigan's 3rd district and the current amount of Democrats stays the same, the Democrats will represent the majority of Michigan's districts. Now, Trump won Michigan in 2016 by a narrow margin, so it will be interesting to see if Michigan's shift towards Democratic federal representatives is indicative of the state's presidential race leanings.
All right, and as polls have just closed and votes are being counted in Michigan, how is this race in Michigan's 3rd congressional district looking?
Well, it's very interesting. So right now, about 35% of the vote has been counted, so there's still a lot coming in, but currently Meyer holds 60.2% of the vote and Scholten only has 39.8%. So there is quite a big difference there. It will be interesting to see if the remaining percent of the vote total will change that in Scholten's favor or not.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing how those results develop. So thank you, Erin, for that information. Now, before we hear from the last interviewee of this hour, we'll hear from members of the Pulpit and Politics FYE about how religiosity influences partisanship.
Good evening, I'm Kate Farson and I'm joined by Grace Blackwell and Ashley Kamau, and we're students in the Pulpit and Politics FYE program this semester. In our religion and political science classes, we've been learning more about how religion and politics relate to one another. And this evening, we're here to provide our analysis of the importance of examining the role religiosity plays in the partisanship of U.S. voters, and thus their voting patterns in elections like the one we're experiencing today. Grace, could you explain what religiosity means?
Thanks, Kate. Yes, religiosity is the measure of one's commitment to their specific religion, their level of devotion. McKendree University defines this relationship for us a little more clearly. Religion is a strong indicator of an individual's voting behavior. Religion has an important impact in how the voter looks at specific issues such as abortion, homosexuality, the environment, and economics.
Thank you for helping us better understand what religiosity means, Grace.
The voter then uses his or her response to these issues as a guideline to help determine which presidential candidate to vote for. It's therefore reasonable to understand that religion has a significant influence on an individual's voting behavior in presidential elections. Due to the strong sway that religiosity has with voting, it's important that as students and Americans, we understand this topic.
According to research that political scientists have conducted over the past 2 decades, there is a general trend that those with higher levels of religiosity are more likely to identify as Republicans and therefore support Republican candidates. More Republicans are weekly church attenders. A lot of religions, such as evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, and Mormons, are all Republican-leaning religions, although there is some percentage of religious Democrats. Democrats gain most of their votes from people with little to no religious faith.
Another thing I wanted to talk about is the growth of the unaffiliated party. So over the years, the unaffiliated party, aka people who don't identify as neither Republican nor Democrat, has been growing rapidly. Ashley, why do you think that is?
Well, I think that the unaffiliated party has grown as much as it has because of the way society has evolved throughout the years. There's been so much change in the way people think, and in this generation, in my opinion, are very free thinkers. So although throughout social media, I've seen a lot of people in my age range talk about how they grew up with a family that has specific beliefs, but then they become sort of the black lamb of the family in a way and develop beliefs and opinions of their own that contradict with their families. And I know that that has probably been a thing for other generations, but to me it seems it's a lot more prevalent in this one. But either way, I think the reason the unaffiliated party is growing so much is because society has changed in a way that made our generation to think more for themselves and actually realize and analyze issues for themselves.
A specific example of the impact of religiosity and religion is the Mormon faith. Members of the Mormon religion exhibit high levels of religiosity. This can be shown in the way that they attend church every Sunday and live by the word of the Bible. Due to this, members of the Mormon religion tend to lean more Republican than Democratic. Ashley, why do you think this is?
Yeah, so I think the Mormon religion as a whole is very serious about their faith and not breaking the rules of their religion. More often than not, Republicans are the party that take a lot more pride in their religion and usually have candidates that express religion more freely and openly. And this also means that they'll typically include more biblical references in their speeches or policies. Grace, do you have maybe a few examples to share with us?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Ashley. Also, the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are overwhelmingly Republican. And ever since the candidacy of Joseph Smith, the founder of the church, the LDS Church became a lot more involved in politics. The home of the church is located in Utah, which is actually one of the reddest states there is, which is thanks to Joseph Smith and his leading of the early Mormons into finding religious freedom.
Also, if you guys remember the 2012 presidential election with presidential candidates Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, you may or may not remember how heavily Mitt Romney identified as Mormon and expressed his Mormon beliefs. I believe he was even criticized, and there were talks amongst the American people about not knowing whether they would want a president who identified as a Mormon.
In addition to being a member of the LDS Church, however, he also completed missionary work and served as a bishop and a stake president in his church. This was a big deal at the time because as a Republican candidate, Romney became the face of Mormonism. And I think a lot of the reason why I immediately associate religion with conservatives is because of that 2012 election. And just remembering how religious Romney was makes me associate religiosity with Republicans.
It's also important to consider that the Christian right is seen as the backbone of the Republican Party.
The Republican Party typically emphasizes the importance of religion and the Bible in the majority of their views. Overall, God tends to play a bigger role in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. Knowing this, the GOP is able to gain votes from specific individuals by knowing how they will vote due to their religious beliefs and ideologies. The belief of God in different religions is just one of the studies that the Pew Research Center has done. This study shows that 73% of Republicans are certain that they believe in God, and only about 55% of the Democratic Party says that they are certain in their belief. Although this isn't the only factor, I believe this could be a fair statement to say that religiosity is typically stronger within conservatives. There are rarely Democratic candidates who see religion as a necessity in their day-to-day life. Looking at some more stats done by the Pew Research Center in 2011, it shows that out of the white evangelical Protestants which lean Democratic, only about 19% of them say that they attend church weekly. By taking a deeper look at these statistics, we are really able to understand how the sense of religiosity within a certain faith can help us understand voting patterns.
Oh, that was really insightful, Grace. Another key factor of this is looking at voting behavior, looking at voting behavior is the ideology of the individual who is voting on a particular issue. One's ideology reflects what is important to that individual, whether it's religious influence, race, ethnicity, gender, or another factor.
An example of this is that while members of the Jewish faith are some of the most loyal supporters of Democratic Party candidates, among those who attend church frequently, 47% of Jews tend to support Republican Party candidates. This may be due to the fact that a denomination of Jews called Orthodox Jews are more likely to support Republican candidates. This can also be compared to the Protestant religion, and evangelical Protestants are strong supporters of the Republican Party candidates. The reason for this may be because of their level of devotion to their religion.
Looking at the different opinions of religious and non-religious groups, it's important in the current society to understand voter preferences and to understand the cultural differences that appear to be dividing the country. It's also beneficial for those who are campaigning or running a campaign to know who will vote on certain issues and how they will vote. In America, religion is part of public life a lot more than other places like Europe. A lot of what the president says has something to do with religion. For example, when the president says things like God bless America or sending prayers to victims of disasters or interacting with religious leaders. Religion is a big part of our country, so there's definitely no doubt that religion has a huge impact on politics. Grace, what about those that don't affiliate with a religion?
Great question, Kate. The religiousness affiliated have become the most reliably Democratic constituents in recent elections. According to national exit polls, 61% of the unaffiliated voted for Al Gore over George W. Bush in 2000. In 2004, oh my God. In 2004, John Kerry's share of the unaffiliated vote increased to 67%. And in 2008, Barack Obama captured fully 3/4 of the vote among the religiously unaffiliated, while 23% voted for John McCain. Despite not being affiliated with a religion, some unaffiliated voters believe that the president should have strong religious beliefs. According to Pew Research, about 1/3 of the unaffiliated, 32%, say it is important for the president to have strong religious beliefs, while 65% say it is not important.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have this evening. We hope we have given you a better understanding of how religiosity influences the partisan allegiances and thus voting behavior of the U.S. electorate. Thanks for listening, and now we'll send you back to the Prin at the Polls broadcast desk.
Thank you to the pulpit and politics students for providing that insight about religion and partisanship. We will now have our last interview of the hour with Afton Leslie of the Women in Politics course. Afton is covering the race in Indiana's 5th Congressional District between Republican Victoria Spartz and Democrat Christina Hale. Hi, Afton.
Hello, Delaney. Thank you.
Now, tell us a little bit about your candidates. Have either Spartz or Hale followed traditional paths into politics?
They both have followed what is termed the pipeline theory or more traditional paths into politics. While other candidates have more experience that could almost perfectly fit a traditional pathway, in law school and years, maybe clerking or something, but these candidates have strong backgrounds in business and both have some experience in office, actually. Spartz was elected to Indiana State to fill the retired incumbent's term in 2017, and then Hale held office in 2012 when she was elected to the Indiana House of Representatives. So they both do have a good amount of background and representation for this election.
Now, could you expand on Hale's time as a former member of the Indiana House of Representatives and how that may influence the race?
Yes, Hale's previous experience could give her an upper hand in this race. While she was in office, she had over 60 bills passed, all with bipartisan support, which is extremely important, known as Indiana's incumbent until today was actually a Republican, Suzanne Brooks. So bringing in a Democrat with bipartisan support passing bills is extremely impressive for Indiana.
And I understand that Spartz is an immigrant from Ukraine. Has her life as a Ukrainian played a role in her political participation?
Well, yes, being born and raised in the Soviet Union, specifically Ukraine, she claims that living in the misery of socialism is what makes her such a passionate candidate for office. During an interview with Indy Star, she describes a story from her grandfather, who had watched his dad leave this small farm, and it was taken over by the Soviet Union leaders, and they stole family's grain. And she always quotes her grandfather saying that government can only cause destruction. And all this basically brings in part that her belief that government involvement is inherently bad and ineffective and should only be used as a tool to incentivize society's betterment. So we can say that's a strong, persuasive reasoning for her life as to why she's so passionate for running for the US election.
All right, and let's take a quick look at some of those finances. Who has the most support from in-state, and who has raised the most for their campaign overall?
Well, Hale has double the in-state support that Spartz does, as well as double of the out-of-state support that Spartz does. So from that standpoint, it looks very clear to me that Hale would have an upper hand in that area. And then in terms of overall campaign amounts, Spartz they both have large amounts up in the millions, and Spartz, 70% of her campaign is actually self-financed. So without her over $1 million contribution, Hale would be far, far ahead of where Spartz is.
It is definitely an interesting distinction with that campaign finance. Now, Indiana's polls closed over 2 hours ago. So what are the numbers looking like as far as votes for each of these candidates?
Well, the most recent polling that I've just pulled up, and actually earlier in the polls too, was looking that Hale was running ahead, or Democrat Christina Hale, and that at 45% of the polls, while Spartz was at 41%. And now with 59% of the votes counted, Spartz is ahead at 49.6%, and Hale is at 46.7%. So it's a very slim margin. And I originally predicted that Hale might win this race because of her experience and her support in and out of the state. But now it's looking like Spartz may be taking over the race, actually, which is, well, I mean, we'll see what happens, but this is pretty interesting.
Yes, it definitely will be interesting to see how that race unfolds. Thank you so much for that information, Afton.
Thank
you.
you.
Folks, we've reached the end of the hour of this broadcast. And next hour, we have some exciting things coming up for you from our anchor, Dana Katie. On behalf of the Print at the Polls team, we hope you're enjoying this election night broadcast. Stay tuned.
to Prin at the Polls, Principia College's live coverage of the 2020 election. My name is Dana Katie, and I'll be your lead anchor for the next portion of our broadcast. We're moving into the third hour, and with more and more states reporting their results, we have plenty of updates for you all. With the number of mail-in ballots this year and the state-by-state discrepancies regarding how and when these votes are counted, it's likely that we won't have the full picture by the end of tonight. However, our broadcast is not slowing down. Over the next hour, we'll be getting exclusive interviews with members of the Women in Politics class, all of whom are tracking key Senate and House races this election. In addition to providing live election updates, we'll also hear from the U.S. and Global Security class again, as well as a special interview with a guest political science professor. So don't go anywhere. In fact, our first interview of the hour is with the special guest himself, Dr. Dante Scala. Dr. Scala is a professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire, and I actually had the pleasure of meeting him in person on the Race for the White House Field Study program, which you got to hear a bit about earlier this evening. Welcome, Dante. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Good evening.
Good evening. So we've heard a lot from Chris, one of our correspondents, about the results over the course of this evening. But what have you personally observed in terms of the major outliers or unexpected developments in the Electoral College results so far?
Yeah, I think so far this evening, I've been keeping one eye on New Hampshire because I'm working with the public radio station here on our coverage, and one eye on the national map. My first impressions is that perhaps once again, the polling that was done has underestimated the amount of President Trump's support, although it's still rather early and there's a lot to sort out yet. Florida in particular looks like it's going to go for President Trump. It's not quite called yet, but Trump seems to have the upper hand, and which suggests that perhaps we're going to have a longer election than maybe some of us were expecting at the beginning of the day, because it looks as if we're going to have to be counting votes for a while longer in various states. Now, clearly, though, President Trump had to win Florida in order to have a chance to win, whereas Joe Biden, as you know, if he can do well in the upper Midwestern states as well as in New Hampshire, he has a path to victory without Florida.
Yeah, so because of that, do you think that we'll have a pretty good idea of who the actual winner will be before tonight ends or not?
If I had to guess right now, I'm thinking not. I think we're going to have to wait for a few days for those ballots that were mailed in, absentee, and so forth to be counted.
Thank you for that opinion. I'm sure that's not ideal for a lot of people, but that's how it is this year.
That's how it is this year, yeah.
And I know you're short on time, so we just have one more question for you.
Sure.
When you talked with the Race for the White House Field program back in January, you mentioned that voters are sometimes motivated by social identity rather than ideology. Have you observed this trend at all in this election?
I think what's emerging in Florida is interesting because it appears that Donald Trump has done better than expected, in part because of the Hispanic vote there, apparently especially Cuban Americans. So that speaks to, perhaps some interesting things that we need to figure out about race and ethnicity in America, because I think the common assumption was that President Trump was going to drive away persons of color in this particular election. And that doesn't appear to be entirely the case. And it seems like there's going to be a more complicated picture than perhaps we expected at the beginning of the day.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and making time to talk with us, Dr. Scala. I think that many of our viewers will be able to make some more sense of the results we see tonight thanks to your expertise. So thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good evening.
You too. Next, we're going to go to Sophie Hills with a presidential election update.
Hi, Dana. Thanks for having me back on.
So CNN is currently reporting Biden with 89 electoral votes and Trump with 72. All polls are now closed except for California, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii. But as we've been hearing throughout the evening, the high number of mail-in ballots this year will likely delay clear results in a number of states. As Dr. Scala was just saying, that is now going to extend things even further than people were anticipating earlier. But the results everyone is most eagerly waiting on are in battleground states. And the gap is widening in Florida, going to Trump with 93% of the vote in. Trump is currently holding 51.2% of the vote compared to the 47.7% going to Biden. Texas, with 76% reporting, shows Trump in the lead with a margin of just 2%. And Biden and Trump are neck and neck in North Carolina, where they have 86% of the vote in. And it's important to remember again that in cases where a low percentage of the vote is reporting the partisan split between mail-in ballots and in-person voting is skewing early results, just making that even more difficult to tell now. And Chris said earlier that nearly 100,000 people voted early, and another aspect to that is that makes up nearly 75% of the total voter turnout in 2016. So there are a lot of ballots to count this year, and then a lot more people voting in person. The polls in Montana, Iowa, Nevada, and Utah just closed, but not much has been reported from those states yet. It's still really early to tell. Pennsylvania is still only 24% reporting, and Trump has a almost 4% lead there. So it's chugging along, but slowly.
Well, thank you for the update, Sophie. It's great to hear more about just how tight these battleground states are. Now let's take it back to the US and global security class, who are going to share their analysis of US relations with China and Russia.
Welcome everyone to our analysis of traditional and contemporary threats to the United States security. Alessandra will start with China as a traditional threat. My name is Kenzie and I'll be looking at China as a contemporary economic challenger. Sammy is studying Russia as a contemporary cyber threat, and Noella is studying Russia as a hybrid threat. We are analysts from Dr. Julie Blaze's political science class, U.S. and Global Security at Principia College. To begin our analysis, Alessandra will start us off.
Thanks, Kenzie. China's growing influence in Asia has now become a major threat to U.S. interests and influence in Asia, because China's main goal is to have more like power and dominion in Asia. So as a response, U.S. policymakers have also been developing and creating new foreign policies to counter China's influence and to preserve U.S. power and influence in Asia.
Continuing to look at China, but through a lens of an economic challenger, China's economy rises and it poses a threat to the United States, especially since the two superpowers are close trading partners and share millions between exports and imports. An influx in China's economy directly impacts the U.S., allowing China to have significant influence over the American economy. As China chases down economic relationships and markets around the globe through its Belt and Road Initiative, it gains international influence. Such an influence can threaten the United States' relationships and hegemony.
Now, looking at Russia, in the 2016 presidential election, the United States witnessed one of the most sophisticated cyber attacks in modern history. According to the report released by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, the Russians infiltrated the US voting systems in all 50 states. While it couldn't be determined whether any of the votes were altered, the fact remains that Russians managed to get into US election systems. 4 years later, the question regarding the security of this election hasn't gotten as much attention as it should have. National security was one of the topics during the final presidential debate, but neither candidate offered a comprehensive plan on how they would secure the election process.
The Russian-Ukrainian war is an ongoing conflict that started in February of 2014 after Crimea announced its independence from Ukraine. That same year, Russia illegally took over Crimea. The decision of Vladimir Putin to seize Crimea and the attempt to destabilize eastern Ukraine has created a widespread concern among Western policymakers that Russia has engaged in national security confrontational strategies that have far-reaching consequences for Russia's relationship with the United States and for the European stability. The tension between Russia and the United States has heightened due to this act.
Thank you. And now we will take a few minutes where we will analyze our threats based by country, looking at comparisons and how they play into the 2020 election. And we are going to start with China.
Thanks, Sammy. There's no simple way to explain China's presence in the 2020 election. Already, U.S. officials have claimed China is interfering in the electoral process. However, Beijing is extremely wary to mention favor for one candidate over the other. Through interactions between China's elites and governmental officials, it has become clear their opposing viewpoints. China is divided on whether President Donald Trump or Joe Biden will provide China with the best future. Certain Chinese officials view Trump's trade war as a direct confrontation and threat to China's economic success. However, leaders of the Chinese Communist Party have been able to rally the people against Western culture and control. This is due to Trump's comments, such as "Make America Great Again" and labeling the coronavirus the China virus. Considering Joe Biden, there is concern within the Chinese government that Biden's intent to oppose China's human rights violations and aggressive regional control will hinder its future plans.
I am going to continue by saying that countering China's influence in Asia is one of the main priorities for both U.S. candidates, because I noticed that Joe Biden and Donald Trump have both discussed and mentioned many times this threat, and also something in common that I noticed that both candidates want to achieve is to preserve U.S. power in Asia and to stop China's growing influence in that region too. So this means that whoever wins these coming elections will make China a target point for future U.S. foreign policies. That's why I think that both candidates are going to plan to develop measures and create new alliances against China. All these facts have led China to infer that both the Democrats and Republicans want to constrain China, and that's why I think that whoever wins these coming elections will challenge the ambitions of China and its leader Xi Jinping.
I completely agree with you, Alessandro, and to continue on to your points, within the last decade, China has looked to the U.S. as a waning power with a stagnant economy. The American response to the coronavirus has expanded these views and has portrayed the U.S. as accelerating its decline. Therefore, it is crucial for the U.S. to present a united and powerful foreign policy towards China. However, after the latest presidential debate on October 22nd, neither candidate was able to describe their exact policies and plan regarding China. As China continues its role as the world's second superpower, the country will likely be a major foreign policy challenge for whichever candidate wins the election. Since China is the U.S.'s largest banker and second largest holder of U.S. debt, the United States does not have the option to cut its ties with China. Therefore, the future president of the United States must enforce a strategy to effectively interact with China while still protecting American security.
That's right, Kenzie. And even though China is not supporting any of the current candidates, some political analysts in China are emphasizing that it could be dangerous for China if Joe Biden wins, because he's planning to work with allies to target China and re-engage with Asian institutions in an attempt to counter China's influence in Asia. Also, some political analysts in China also are believing that Joe Biden, if elected, might do damage to China's ambitions and encourage U.S. allies to stand up to Beijing. That's why China's officials see Joe Biden as a candidate who will restore strong ties with American allies and convince other Asian nations to pressure China more effectively. So a Biden win will mean more re-engagement with Asian institutions and the creation of a coalition of countries to isolate China. Now we're going to focus in Russia.
Yeah, and now as looking at Russia, the Russian acquisition of Crimea and Ukraine has challenged the hybrid warfare notion. And the hybrid warfare is a military tactic that uses political warfare and mixes it with conventional warfare. Irregular warfare, cyber warfare, and other means of control such as fake news, diplomacy, and international electoral interference. Russia has succeeded in all of the above. It has included in its strategy unconventional tactics to achieve conventional goals of territorial acquisition. With the advance in technology, we see that in 2015, Russia attacked Ukraine's power grid, which shut down electricity for hundreds of thousands of people for several hours. The Ukrainian and US officials blamed it on Moscow. This is an example of precisely a type of cyber activity that is seen in warfare, and the result is equivalent to those that can be accomplished using military forces.
It's no secret that the United States and Russia are not on great terms with one another. Though then candidate Trump wondered if it wouldn't be a good thing if we got along with Russia, this hasn't exactly happened when he became president, particularly with the ongoing investigations into Russian interference by Robert Mueller and the recent indictment of Russian intelligence officers in connection with some of the most damaging cyber attacks against US allies. However, while relations have remained rather tense under the Trump administration, the Kremlin has lived rather comfortably than under the Obama administration. It is a very different tone compared to the Obama administration that Russia seems to be okay with.
Yeah, and now since taking the office, the Trump administration has continued to pressure Russia over its role in eastern Ukraine. The United States and the European Union has threatened and enforced sanctions against Russia for its involvement in this crisis. The US and the European Union have urged Russia to withdraw its forces. The US says that Russia has invaded Crimea in violation of various agreements protecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And now looking at the US election, Russia seems to be favoring Trump's election again for the second time in 2020 election, and this time over Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, which it perceives as unfriendly to Russian interests. It should also be recalled that Biden, as a vice president, played a part in the sanction campaign against Russia following its annexation of Crimea in 2014. Russia's involvement in 2020 election in the United States is a major concern at the highest level of national security within the United States government.
Exactly, Noella. And the problem that we're seeing is that Russia has a vast interest in who the next US president is going to be. And they do not like the idea of a Biden presidency, since that will bring a very strong shift in policy, like Noella mentioned. Experts believe that it is likely that a Biden presidency will make relations between the two countries even more difficult, since a Biden administration is likely going to follow the pattern of previous Democratic presidents to be tough on Russia, though this issue, again, wasn't really addressed until the final presidential debate on October 22nd, when national security came up as a topic.
So as my final argument, I just want to say that again, that both candidates want to increase US power and influence in Asia and are willing to create new foreign policies to challenge China's interests and growing influence in Asia.
Continuing to look at China through a contemporary lens, after the Cold War, the United States came out on top as the world's leading nation. However, within the last decade, China's economy, influence, and standing has risen to a point of contention against the US. Whichever president wins the 2020 election will have to formulate a policy to approach China as a rising economic challenger.
The United States remain committed to reestablishing the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It does not recognize Russia's claim to Crimea and encouraging Russia and Crimea to settle their dispute through the Minsk agreement. The security threat in Eastern Europe has put the government of Ukraine at risk and has also threatened the lives of Ukrainian and Russian citizens.
No other country has used its cyber capabilities as irresponsible as Russia has. For too long, cybersecurity has been ignored, and the 2016 presidential election showed us that. As a result of the 2016 election, voting machines were declared critical infrastructure, giving states and counties more money to update voting machines that print a paper backup, so there's a paper verification for each vote in an effort to protect the legitimacy of the election process in the United States.
And this concludes our segment. Thank you for listening to our roundtable table discussion and about how the threat of Russia and China has evolved in the recent years.
Great to hear another insightful discussion from the U.S. and global security class. Now it's time to move into interviews with experts on some important congressional races happening tonight, all members of the Women in Politics class this semester. Let's start by hearing from Katie Cunningham, who's covering the Iowa Senate race between Republican incumbent Joni Ernst and Democratic challenger Teresa Greenfield. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Dana. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. How has Ernst's support of President Trump affected her poll numbers during this Senate race against anti-Trump Democrat Teresa Greenfield?
Well, Ernst has proudly supported Trump and his policies while in office, but Trump has actually had declining poll numbers in Iowa. And interestingly enough, the Iowa suburbs have actually become more anti-Trump. But the Trump supporters who are in Iowa are obviously going to be much more supportive of Ernst. But because those suburbs are becoming more anti-Trump, that'll actually probably be better for Greenfield.
I understand that this Senate race is one of the most expensive and competitive in history. What do you think has made it that way?
Well, we know that Iowa is a swing state, but I think what's most important is that this election will help determine who has control in the Senate. And since that Iowa is a swing state, it'll be really interesting to see how it'll turn out.
Definitely. So since Ernst is the first female senator Iowa has ever had, and this current race is between two women, how do you see the campaign strategies and results of this election affecting women in Iowa specifically?
Well, first, I'd just like to congratulate Ernst for being the first woman, because I think that's a really big accomplishment. And now, since it's between two women, I think that's showing massive progress in the overall mindset of Iowans, especially since just like a couple decades ago, it was between two men. But because it's so expensive, it's actually the second most expensive next to North Carolina. And they've already spent over $200 million. And just as an example, Ernst spent just $17 million from October 1st through October 14th. I think it's really interesting that both women are going off of the standpoint that they had a farming-based childhood, especially since Iowa has so many farms. But Ernst has not exactly done what she's promised that she said that she would do in her 2014 race. And during one of the debates, she couldn't answer a few questions about cropping that were pretty basic questions for most farmers in Iowa. So that, as a result, really hurt her poll numbers.
And then finally, the results for this particular race are just slowly creeping in. Only county by county so far. Not that much has been reported yet, but what can you say about the current vote totals for this race?
Well, we know that it's expected that most, but not all of the votes will be counted tonight on election night. And the last polls closed at 9 p.m. Central Time, so about a half an hour ago. Ernst has actually been polling even stronger in her race, Greenfield has been polling even stronger in her race against Ernst than Biden had against Trump. And from June through October, it looked like Greenfield was doing pretty well, but then in October, at the end of it, Ernst was actually ahead for the first time by 4 percentage points, even though Greenfield was ahead by 3 percentage points for quite a bit of time. Right now, though, Ernst is at 37.1% and Greenfield is at 60.4%. So it'll be really interesting to see how this all turns out.
It will. Seems like a very tight race. Well, thank you so much, Katie, for being here.
Thank you so much, Dana.
And now we're going to take a quick break, but we will be back soon. Welcome back to Prin at the Polls. Before we continue with the interviews from the Women in Politics classmates, let's go to a live presidential update with our correspondent, Chris Strong. Chris, tell us about some new state projections.
Hello, thank you for having me on once again. Since 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, 4 states have closed their polls. This includes Iowa, Montana, Utah, and the battleground state of Nevada. Now, 44 out of 50 states, along with all 13 key swing states, have now closed. And there have been 3 states that have been projected in the past hour. This includes New Hampshire to the Biden campaign, according to NBC News. That's 4 electoral votes. And that's the first of the 13 battleground states that have been decided so far tonight, but definitely the one with that has less of a consequence to the Trump campaign. As well as New Hampshire, we have New Mexico going to the Biden campaign, according to NBC News. That's 5 electoral votes. And no doubt here, Kansas is going to Donald Trump, according to NBC News. That's 6 electoral votes. So where we currently stand, Biden has 98 electoral votes and Trump has 86. Trump has a 2 million popular vote lead, nearly 50% into the expected votes. A big shocker after Hillary Clinton beat Trump by nearly 2% in the popular vote last time. But there's definitely still a lot of time with all the California vote and all of the mail-in votes for votes to still come in for Biden.
That's a good point. So which states would you say are currently the most important for each candidate?
Well, if I'm Donald Trump and I'm sitting in the White House right now watching this, I would say that I'm salivating when looking at the Southeast. That includes Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. He's already pretty close to winning in 2 of those states, Florida and Georgia. Only 56% is in Georgia, but he has a 12% lead. He has a 4% lead in Florida with 94% of the votes in. Right now for Trump, I'm looking at North Carolina. North Carolina, he has a 0.8% lead with 90% of the votes coming in. If he can get that vote, according to 538's interactive map, this would be a 50-50 race compared to before this election started. 538 had Biden winning 9 out of 10 times. In contrast, if Biden's able to come back in North Carolina, he would have a 92% chance to win the election. So that's just a huge margin between losing in North Carolina and winning. If we're looking at other states right now, I would look across the country over to Arizona. This looks better for Biden so far. He's leading by 8.7%. and has around 1.3 million votes compared to the 1.1 of Donald Trump. So definitely a good look so far in Arizona. But we're looking at a long election right now. If we're looking at the Southeast and Trump taking all 3 states potentially, not yet, we're looking at a long night and a long week looking toward Pennsylvania.
We'll definitely keep an eye on those states. Thank you so much for that update. Now we're going to return to our interviews with the Women in Politics class. Next, we're going to hear about the House race in Minnesota's 7th Congressional District between Democratic incumbent Collin Peterson and Republican challenger Michelle Fischbach. And covering this race is Ryan Dupalou. Welcome, Ryan.
Hello, thank you.
Good to have you here. So, what is Michelle Fischbach's background? What are her strengths and weaknesses in this race?
So Michelle Fischbach is a Republican, and she served as Minnesota's 49th lieutenant governor a couple of years ago. She grew up in a very active family, politically speaking. Her mother, Darla, was also a member of the GOP, and she was a member of various pro-life groups. Fischbach's family and faith, she indeed is a practicing Roman Catholic, have undoubtedly deeply shaped her views on abortion. She started politics in the small town of Painesville, Minnesota, as a member of the local city council, and then she gradually climbed the ladder. In this race, her keen knowledge of local politics might have definitely helped her. She presents herself as a proven conservative who defends the right to keep and bear arms, who is pro-life, and who claims that reforms need to be undertaken concerning tax policy and healthcare. Her opponent tonight is Collin Peterson, the incumbent from the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is a local branch of the Democratic Party. Fischbach asserts that Peterson's 14 terms in the House made him grow out of touch. But Peterson's current role as the chair of the Agriculture Committee in the House demonstrates his skills when it comes to defending agricultural policies and interests.
Thank you. So, no Republican presidential candidate has ever won the state of Minnesota since 1972. Is the state not as deep blue as it seems? And is that why a Republican like Fischbach is competitive in this race?
So politically speaking, the state of Minnesota is actually more complicated to analyze than what might appear at first glance. Even though presidential candidates from the Democratic Party have long won the state, we need to zoom in to understand the diversity of results depending on the region. The urban areas around Minneapolis and St. Paul mainly voted Democrat for the last presidential elections, but the district I'm focusing on, which is the very large 7th Congressional District, is truly rural, conservative, and mostly made up of a white population, and it is therefore represented in Washington by a congressman who knows how to speak to the farmers and how to defend their interests. The state of Minnesota is thus not as deep blue as it may seem at first glance, because it is made up of both urban and rural areas where people do not vote the same way and do not necessarily share the same stances. A Republican like Fischbach therefore appears to be a competitive candidate in such a rural district.
The polls leading up to tonight show this race to be very tight, and even tonight with results slowly coming in, it seems like they're pretty evenly split for the most part. So what more can you tell us about why it's so competitive and about the current vote totals in this race?
So the last results and estimations that I got have been updated a few minutes ago. And according to these estimations, 37% of the votes are for Peterson and 57% for Fischbach, and only actually 10% of the votes have been counted for now, which doesn't really allow us to get a very accurate idea of the race. So I think we'll need to wait and to see how it unfolds.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Ryan, all the way from France. We really appreciate you calling in at a time that is very early in the morning for you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we're going to hear from Cassidy Proctor about the House race in the 24th Congressional District in Texas between Republican Beth Van Dyne and Democrat Candace Valenzuela. Hi, Cassidy.
Hi.
Have Valenzuela and Dyne followed traditional paths to politics or not? And can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so in our Women in Politics class, we've read about women in politics and the concept of the pipeline theory, which is that certain professions like law and progressive political experience, like the concept of progressive ambition, help candidates run for office. However, because of the long history of gender discrimination and gender stereotypes, these career paths haven't always been accessible to female candidates. So that being said, Valenzuela has not followed the typical pipeline theory career path. She has been educated in, she has a degree in government and has worked in law offices and has frequently, and has worked in education as well. And then Beth Van Dyne has had a more traditional path in politics, as she served as the mayor of the city of Irby from 2011 to 2017, and was a member/deputy mayor pro term for the city of Irby Council from 2004 to 2010.
Interesting. Can you explain how demographics specifically have changed in the 24th Congressional District that we're talking about?
Yeah, so the 24th District is a suburban district, and these suburban districts are becoming more diverse, and it's becoming harder for the Republican Party to hold on to these districts that they used to be able to easily rely on. So if Valenzuela wins, she not only flips her district, but she also becomes the first Afro-Latina to serve in Congress. And Valenzuela represents this changing demographic in suburban areas.
That would make a big difference. Definitely a historical election then. Mm-hmm. You've already been doing this a bit throughout your interview, but can you touch on the importance of this race even further? Anything we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, so over the course of the last 4 years, trends show that the 24th District of Texas might not go red like it did in 2016. The 24th District of Texas is a toss-up right now, and Texas itself has voted, or the district itself hasn't voted blue since 2004, and Texas itself has not voted blue since 1976 when they voted for Jimmy Carter. Texas is a large state, and the seat that Valenzuela is running for is open, and this means that she can really only gain experience from this. So it'll be interesting to see where her political career takes her.
Based on the results that I have been following with this race specifically, it looks very close, like within a percentage point, which is very interesting and exciting. I'm also a native Texan, like Chris Strong, so it's fun to watch. And do you think that it's possible that Valenzuela could take this?
I do think it's possible with the changing demographic. It'll be really interesting. According to Valenzuela, it's in her favor. She feels like she resonates with a lot of the people there, and her story does as well. But yeah, like you said, it has been less than a percentage point difference for the past couple hours. So it'll be very interesting to see where this race goes.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your time, Cassidy.
Thank you.
Before we go into more of our content and interviews, we're going to take a quick break again, but we'll be back shortly. Welcome back. Next up, we're continuing with our Women in Politics class interviews, and we have Noah Stewart, who has been following the House race for Illinois' 13th district between Republican incumbent Rodney Davis and Democratic challenger Betsy Dirksen Londrigan. And this is an interesting race specifically because this district is where Principia College is located, so it is very relevant to all of us here on campus and enrolled. Hi, Noah.
Hi, Dana.
So this race is a rematch from 2018, which resulted in Davis retaining his seat. What suggests that the outcome might be different this time around?
Yeah, so this time it's going to be certainly close again. I just want to take a look back at 2018 before looking at today. And in 2018, the New York Times conducted a poll 1.5 weeks before the election in which Davis was 5 points ahead of Dirksen Londrigan with 46% of the vote. Well, the most recent poll we have out of this district is by Tolchin Research. It was done in early October, and this time around, Dirksen Londrigan had 5 points ahead of Davis. So it might flip around, but what we definitely know is that it's going to be competitive again. Nothing's for certain in this district. In August, Londrigan was ahead. In September, Davis was back in the lead. Then the latest poll, as I said, Londrigan was ahead again. And when we look at it tonight, it looks like Davis is leading so far.
Sounds like this race will be competitive to the end. Is there anything about the candidate's political experience that plays into this dynamic?
Yeah, we've got two candidates from very different sides of the political experience field. I'd say Londrigan is what some might call Illinois' 13th district's AOC. She has little political experience except for a bachelor's degree in political science from U of I. She's a mother of 3 children. She worked different jobs over the years, with her most recent job being working for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. What the platform she's running on is sort of the normal citizen that's detached from the big power politics some might see in Washington. She's campaigning on a promise that everyone should get the health care they need after a health incident that her son had a few years ago that was very traumatizing for the family. On the other hand, Rodney Davis has served as representative for the 13th district since 2012. He's a career politician. He worked for different politicians before becoming a representative in the House and has focused his political work on supporting agriculture, rural communities, small businesses, and veterans. So the toss-up in this district might show that voters are torn. For one, they might want change. On the other hand, they might want to stick with what they know with Davis. What might be another possibility is that the presidential nominees could have an impact on the vote in this district as well. With latest projections by 538 that averaged the polls, Biden was leading in Illinois with 16 points, and that might increase Londrigan's popularity this time around, especially considering that Davis voted with Trump in the past 4 years around 90% of the time. So if Illinois goes to Biden, and if the voters in the 13th district are also sort of ready for change, that might be the edge that Londrigan needs today.
Sounds like a match between two very different candidates. How would you think that the outcome of this race might affect Principia College, given that we are in the district that this race is going down in?
That's a really interesting question, Dana. It's kind of hard to answer, and it's hard to tell, basically. What we can say is that Davis has been a strong supporter of religious freedom. He actually referenced Christian Science and Principia College in his remarks on the floor in the House when he was arguing the EACH Act. And the EACH Act wanted to release people who relied on religious belief for healing from the requirement to purchase and maintain minimum essential health care coverage mandated under the Affordable Care Act. So we know that Davis is aware of Principia, he's knowledgeable of Christian Science values, and he has stood up for them in Congress. That's not to say that Londrigan doesn't take that position or that she isn't aware of Prin. All we can say is that Davis knows Principia better, but whether he can best represent the political views of those on campus is another question. Either way, the race will remain exciting to follow and certainly be exciting for Prin campus to follow as well.
Definitely. And based on the sources that I have, it looks like a lot of the results are actually coming in pretty steadily for this race. And based on what we have now, it looks like Davis is slightly in the lead. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, like you said, Davis is in the lead currently. It's still pretty close to call. And what's interesting to consider is that mostly red counties have reported in the 13th district. For example, Jersey County, where Prin is, has 82.7% voting for Davis. But we're still waiting to hear from votes from many other counties that were a toss-up or Democrat leaning in 2018. So a best indicator for that is, for example, Sangamon County, where in 2018, 55% voted for Londringham and 45% for Davis. And that's the same this time around. Tonight we've got 54.5% for Londringham and 45.5% for Davis. But we can say it will definitely stay competitive, especially as we get in the results from more blue counties in the district, and obviously the mail-in ballots.
Great, Noah. And thank you as well for calling in at this very early hour in the morning for you in Germany. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Pleasure to be there.
Our last interview of the hour is with Caitlin Crack, who's here to tell us about the race between Democratic incumbent Lauren Underwood and Republican challenger Jim Oberweis in Illinois' 14th district. Great to have you here, Caitlin.
Hi, Dana. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Since Underwood, who is the incumbent in this race, has such an extensive background in the healthcare industry, how has that influenced her political career and this particular race?
Well, since Underwood has had a whole career as a nurse previous to being a politician, it has been a main platform for her. She began in politics by actually working under the Obama administration as being a senior healthcare advisor. She actually helped write the Affordable Care Act. So healthcare has been a really main platform for Underwood throughout this race and her position.
Can you tell us more about the major accomplishments or pitfalls of her last term in office, and how has this been affecting this campaign for her?
Yeah, for sure. Well, during Underwood's last term, she held multiple town meetings. She held multiple community events. And so she, as someone who is someone of the community, she wanted to really be involved with the people that she was representing. And she really made that known. And she really had constant communication with people. She's very active on social media and is very open to talking to people in her community. Whereas since she did help write the Affordable Care Act, she is actually, that weight has been carried with her throughout her term, since that is such a partisan view now. So it's been very interesting to see that she is with the people, but also she's getting backlash from her stance with healthcare.
And it's interesting to note that she's a woman of color at the same time as well. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, yeah. So she is actually not only the first woman to have served a term with this district, she's also the first woman of color. And so she's been breaking a lot of walls with her term, and it's been very exciting to watch her be in charge.
For sure. Again, I have been looking at some of the results for this race, and it's very close, just like the last one in Illinois. The source that I have right now says that Underwood is just slightly above Oberweis, with slightly less results being reported than the 14th district, or than the 13th district, sorry. But can you comment about how close this race is and why it seems so tight at the moment, and what this could mean for the rest of the night?
Yeah, no, it has been incredibly close. And I've been kind of watching the numbers this evening, and it has definitely been kind of going back and forth. Oberweis takes the lead for a second, but then begins to fall behind, and Underwood begins to gain momentum. And it has really been a back and forth thing this whole time. It's been very interesting because Oberweis he's been funding his own campaign, whereas Underwood has gotten a lot of outside support. And so it's just the different dynamic of the Republican nominee versus the Democratic nominee. and to see the two dynamics and how that's being reflected, because Illinois is a blue state. And so it just is interesting to see that although as a total it is a blue state, Oberweis does have some grounding and does have some pull.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing about this race. Definitely an important one to keep an eye on. And thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Dana.
Well, that does it for hour 3 of our Print at the Polls broadcast. We hope you've gotten a lot out of our coverage and guest interviews. And we actually have a bonus half hour coming up with even more content. So be sure to stay tuned, and we will be right back after another short break. watching Prin at the Polls, Principia College's live coverage of the 2020 election. We're entering the last leg of our broadcast now, so this portion will only be 30 minutes instead of an hour, but we hope you stick with us as we still have lots of great content, including more updates about various congressional races, a final presidential update, and a special interview with Christian Science Monitor correspondent Story Hinckley, so stay tuned. First, let's hear from my co-anchor, Delaney Gatine, about the latest news on the presidential election.
Hi, Dana. Thank you. So the polls are updating rapidly here. And according to Associated Press, just moments ago, we had Biden with 209 electoral votes and Trump with 112, and more results continue to develop. 4 more states just closed on the hour, none of them swing states. But we do have our three of our major swing states are getting closer. We have Texas with 83% reporting according to NBC News. And in Texas right now, Trump is ahead 51.6% to Biden's 47.1%. And then in Pennsylvania with 73% reporting, according to Associated Press, they have Trump ahead by 4%. And then as well in Florida, we're getting really close with 97% reporting. And in that state, Trump is leading by 3.5%. So it is looking like Trump is pulling ahead in some of those larger swing states, but there's still much more time to come and mail-in ballots that still have to be counted.
Definitely. Well, we know that Ohio is a swing state, and as votes are being counted, what can you tell us about the importance of the results in that state particularly?
Yeah, so something interesting about Ohio is that the state has sided with the winning candidate in every election except for 2 since 1986. So not to say that tradition can't be broken, but that is a state that we will be looking at, especially in this election. And with 90% reporting a few minutes ago, they had Trump leading by 7.5% in the state.
That might seem small, but it could be just what he needs to pull a victory in that one. So with Trump leading in North Carolina, Texas, and Florida, all important swing states, as you've said, where is Biden looking for a victory?
So Arizona has actually become increasingly important to Biden as a supplement to his victories in states with large numbers of electoral votes. Some sources have just gone ahead and called traditionally Democratic states like California and Washington. And then, of course, we have his victory in New York, a traditionally Democratic state as well. So in 2016, Trump won Arizona's 11 electoral votes. But with 73% of the voting in just a few minutes ago, according to Associated Press, Biden was leading by a whopping 8.7%. So that'll definitely be an interesting change there if that lead continues.
What can you tell us about the demographics of voters for each of the candidates? That's something we haven't really touched on yet. And would you say that the results are unfolding as expected or not?
Yeah, actually. So as expected right now with the voters, we have younger voters, women, and racial minorities that are largely siding with Biden. And as you get higher in the age range, they're kind of split between Trump and Biden. And then with women and men, women are actually a larger percent of the turnout right now favoring Biden, and men tend to favor Trump. So that's been an interesting dynamic, but nothing that is unexpected.
And then let's take it back really quickly to away from the presidential election to the Senate and House races that we've been following throughout the night. How have these been unfolding?
Yeah, so overall, there hasn't been too much surprise happening. We have every few minutes, it seems like one of the races is called and Democrats and Republicans gain or lose a seat. But overall, it's splitting pretty even. We have one Senate seat in Colorado that was gained for Democrats, and it's looking like ex-Governor Hickenlooper, who is a Democrat, is projected to beat Republican Senator Gardner. But overall, the wins and losses of Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and in the House are splitting even, with just about the expected number of Democrats and Republicans called right now. No big surprises there.
Sounds like we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Yep, thank you, Dana.
Yeah, thank you so much for that update, Delaney. Now we are going to continue hearing from members of the Women in Politics class as they tell us about a handful of congressional races that we should have on our radars. We'll start with Kiki Holmes, who is covering the Arizona Senate race between Republican incumbent Martha McSally and Democratic challenger Mark Kelly. Welcome, Kiki.
Hi, Dana.
Hi. So is it correct that the seat that is being fought for right now between these two candidates is the one that was held by the late senator and 2008 presidential candidate John McCain?
Yes, McSally had previously ran for the Arizona Senate seat in 2018, but fell short to Kirsten Sinema. And after the passing of Senator John McCain in 2019, Governor Doug Ducey appointed McSally to the seat. She had been representing the 8th Congressional District of Arizona in the U.S. House from 2014 to 2019 before being appointed to the Senate seat.
Good to know. While both candidates come from military backgrounds, can you describe how the other aspects of the careers have pushed them to run in this race?
Yeah, so a little bit about McSally. She's obviously a House representative, and she was also a legislative fellow, a national security advisor under John Kyle, and a professor of the National Security Studies, as well as being a colonel in the Air Force. Mark Kelly, on the other hand, was an astronaut and an engineer for NASA. And what really pushed him to run this year was his wife and former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who in 2012 had to resign from her seat due to a gunshot wound. From that, they created a PAC called Giffords, which helped promote for the prevention of gun violence and just stricter gun laws to help with any sort of gun violence that's going on in the country. So that has really launched his career into running for Senate.
And how specifically are the dynamics of the presidential race impacting this Senate race?
It's an interesting question because Arizona currently is a toss-up state. With McSally, she is somewhat of a blind follower for Trump. Most of the time, 90% of the time, she does follow or agree with what President Trump says and what he works towards. But Arizona has a divided partisan standpoint currently. There's actually a PAC in Arizona that's called Arizonan Republicans Who Believe in Treating Others with Respect, that's like the name of it. And all of them are Republicans. All who are a part of it are Republicans voting and supporting Biden in this election. And I think that with the divided partisanship within the state, McSally's following for President Trump has created that even stronger divide, which causes others to not necessarily want to follow her. And so it's just creating a larger toss-up.
It seems like McSally has been trailing in the polls leading up to tonight. Is this a statement on her campaign, or is Trump's declining popularity in the state having an impact on McSally's prospects? What would you say?
I think given Trump's rally that he had in Arizona last week, it was very clear that McSally and her standpoints weren't as cohesive with President Trump. So it was changing a lot. And I think that it's not necessarily on her campaign. It's more on his declining popularity. It's just his lack of popularity is causing a lot of issues and a lot of division. And it's definitely a different year in Arizona.
Yeah, and I understand that the way, like you were saying, that Trump treated McSally at that rally definitely supports what you have been telling us and what we've been seeing. So based on my own tracking of this race, it actually seems pretty close. And maybe that's surprising to you or not. What would you say?
I wouldn't say it's surprising. I think that it is a big switch from having such a beloved figure as John McCain for a very long time in the state and being such a prominent figure into having him pass away in 2019 and going into a presidential election where it is so divided, I think having this switch and having a Democratic candidate lead is definitely different, but I don't think it's surprising given the division and given John McCain's passing.
Do you think it's likely that Kelly could win this thing?
I do. In polls right now, he's leading by just about 10%, and I think that that's really telling that he cares about the state, and it's what he's doing in his PAC and everything that's being that he's being supported by is really telling of the state and just their state of mind too, where it is a divided sort of area, and who they agree with is really just a toss-up also. So it's kind of this interesting time that Arizona is just being split.
Thank you so much, Kiki. Great to have that information and great to have you here.
Thank you.
Let's go now to Olivia Burby, another member of the Women in Politics class, who has been covering the House race in New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District between Democratic incumbent Xochitl Torres Small and Republican challenger Yvette Harrell. Hi, Olivia.
Hello.
Good to have you here. So Torres Small won her district with a margin of fewer than 4,000 votes back in 2018. With this district being traditionally Republican, what about New Mexico's demographics predict another left-leaning term like the 2018 one?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dana. New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District has been really interesting to follow because the past few elections were challenging to predict, which was the case last election, as you mentioned, in 2018, when Xochitl Torres Small of the Democratic Party won with fewer than 4,000 votes, which is a really close election, which many people speculate has to do with New Mexico's changing demographics and the increase of Hispanic Latinx voters in this district. And seeing that Xochitl Torres Small, who is a Mexican American, makes her an approachable and attractive candidate for them.
Yeah, good to have on our radars about that demographic. Torres Small is vocal about her views on the oil and gas industry in particular. Can you say more about that and how that's maybe different from other mentalities in the political field?
Yeah, for sure. Oil and gas has been very relevant topic leading up to this election in New Mexico. The oil and gas industry plays a huge role in New Mexico's economy. So both Torres Small and Yvette Harrell of the Republican Party support fracking to some degree. Torres Small deviates from expected, more progressive liberal stances on oil and gas because she finds they simply do not reflect the reality that her constituents face, meaning that she wants to improve the current process and wants to better what's already established rather than overhaul the system entirely, which is a more liberal stance to her counterpart, Harrell, who sees oil and gas as the lifeblood of New Mexico's economy and fully supports the producers of oil and gas at the rate that they're producing now.
Yeah, I feel like that definitely sets Torres Small apart from some of her other Democratic comrades. So I've been looking a bit at this race, and it seems that with 45% reporting, or around 50% reporting, it actually looks like Yvette Harrell is in the lead, who is the challenger in this race. So is that surprising? What do you think? Do you think that that's going to stay the same and she's going to win this thing by the end of the night? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I've mentioned, this district is kind of notoriously challenging to predict. In 2018, it was a very similar pattern with Harrell leading up through the night when Torres Small came in with pulling through with the lead with the mail-in ballots and some of the late voters. And so I think this one will be very interesting to follow through the night because of the kind of toss-up nature of this district.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Olivia. That was great to hear about this very interesting race.
Perfect. Thank you, Dana.
Now it's time for our final interview of the night with the Women in Politics classmates. We're going to hear from Kenzie Winton, who's going to tell us more about the race in California's 25th congressional district between Republican incumbent Mike Garcia and Democratic challenger Christy Smith. Thank you so much for joining us, Kenzie.
Thank you, Dana.
Since this election between Garcia and Smith is a rematch from earlier this year, what makes the current election any different?
So what's really interesting and also different about this election is its proximity to the presidential race. So polling data from within the last month shows that the 25th district shows favor for Smith and Vice President Joe Biden. And this information is crucial because it shows how much the presidential race impacts this current special election. So earlier on, Mike Garcia tied himself to Trump and did not reach out to moderate Democrats. So if, as we're seeing, the 25th district is already leaning towards Biden as its presidential candidate, then it means that Smith might kind of receive the other side of this and will receive a one-up that she didn't have in the May election. And also along with the presidential election's proximity, there is another change that has happened due to the restrictions of COVID. So due to these restrictions, Smith and Garcia have had to rely on virtual town halls, their online presence, and voter reach out. So whichever candidate is more effective in this will kind of give them a one-up in winning the election as well.
Smith particularly has been acknowledged for her impressive number of Democratic endorsements. Can you tell us more about where those endorsements are coming from and how they affect this election?
Yes, Dana, thank you for the question. So Smith has received endorsements from Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Kamala Harris, and hundreds of other well-known Democratic political leaders and party members. However, these endorsements has given her heat from the Republican Party, which has used these endorsements as a way to try and persuade voters not to vote for Smith. However, as I mentioned in the last question, the 25th congressional district in California has already been showing a reflection of the presidential race. So this could be extremely beneficial for Smith to have the support of the current Democratic presidential candidate.
During her time as a California Assemblywoman, it looked like Smith went against the Democratic Party's desires when she voted against taxes on small businesses and families for the 38th Assembly. So when considering that, has Smith lost any support from the Democratic Party? And do you think it's impacting her in this race right now?
So the answer to this question is rather surprising. While Smith did lose immediate support from the Democratic Party on voting no, she still was able to regain that support. So as I mentioned in the last question, Smith has still received some support from influential Democratic Party members. And while her decision did lose her support as an assemblywoman, it was only from her party. So she actually, by showing to her constituents she was putting them first, she actually gained voter support. And when it came to her running for the US House, she once again received full support from the Democratic Party, so that really will not be an issue for her.
Interesting. I understand that Mike Garcia has little previous political experience, while Smith is well known in the political realm. How do you think that one's previous political experience plays into this race?
So I think it will end up being pretty important, and it will kind of be favoring Smith at the moment rather than Garcia. Because due to his short term in the US House and lack of political experience, voters know little about him and how he tends to vote. And during the last special election in May, there actually was very little voter turnout, which some political analysts say is the reason that Smith did not win. However, due to its proximity this time to the presidential race, voters are a lot more energized in the 25th congressional district. And so Garcia has had a short time in the US House, but he still hasn't been able to show his constituents what he's all about and how he tends to vote. And so it's quite possible that voters will not support him this time around because he has not been able to prove or follow through with any of the promises he made in the last special election.
Great. So like many of the races that we've been looking at tonight, based on the results that have been reported, which in this one, it's not too much. Right now, it's only about 19 to 20% actually reporting, but it's very close, once again, between Garcia and Smith. It looks like Garcia might have a slight edge over Smith, which would mean that it's a Republican holding this House seat. And could you tell us a little bit more on that and the results that you've been following, and maybe even what it would mean for, like, what it means having this Republican favored to be the winner in this particular race in this deep, deep blue California state?
Yeah, Dana, it'll be extremely interesting because polls from only a month ago showed that Smith was actually in favor, but only by 4%. So that's still a margin of error, which can be contributed to what we're seeing now. But I think it will be really close throughout the whole entire time. So I don't think we can really predict that Mike Garcia will be winning. And it will be really interesting for California because while this seat was flipped, Katie Hill had it earlier when she had to resign, and then it was flipped to a Republican seat. He wasn't there for very long in the US House. So this will kind of be interesting to see if he does end up winning, how it plays out in California, and if at the end of the day, Democratic voters are able to turn out for Smith, or if Mike Garcia does indeed win.
Definitely a lot to consider there. Thank you so much, Kenzie, and we hope you have a good rest of your night.
Thank you, Dana.
So, for the final time tonight, let's hand it over to Chris Strong with another presidential election update. What have you got for us, Chris?
Thank you so much, Dana, for one last time. As of 10 p.m. Central Standard Time, every state other than Hawaii and Alaska have fully closed their polls across the country. New closings in the past hour include California, Oregon, Idaho, and Washington State. All 13 battleground states have now closed. If we're looking at the results so far throughout the entire night, since this is the final update, there have been results for 31 states according to NBC News, and only one battleground, that being just the 3 electoral votes for New Hampshire. And currently Biden is leading 192 to Trump with 114 electoral votes. With around 55% of expected votes in, Trump is leading the popular vote by nearly 3.5 million over Joe Biden. Only 1.5% or 1.3 million voters have gone to third party candidates this time around, compared to closer to 5% in 2016. So now that we've looked at all of this, I'd like to look at our battleground states and kind of the week ahead. Now that the Southeast states have pretty much ended their races, not confirmed yet for NBC News, but Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia, all looking like they're going to go to the Trump campaign. Our eyes are going to shift over to Arizona and Nevada for the rest of the night. In Arizona, currently, Biden is leading 8%, 8.5% in fact, with 75% polling so far. Over in Nevada, still 0% is showing up according to NBC News. So we'll see if there's a problem in Nevada or if it's just late to join the party of battleground states, although it seems like every state is late to join the party this time around with the amount of mail-in voters. So looking at the week ahead, we have to look toward the Rust Belt. That includes Minnesota, that includes Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. It's just so key that now that Joe Biden has lost all of the Southeast, he needs to take, out of the 6 important states left, he needs to take 4, 5, or 6. If you look at, although Arizona and Nevada are looking and leaning like they're going to go to Biden, let's theoretically say that Trump takes both Arizona and Nevada. But Biden still has a chance to come back in this race with the 4 Rust Belt states. That's how important they are. And these are the states that were the closest in the 2016 election, with 3 of the Rust Belt states being decided by 80,000 votes total. So that while this may be a very stressful week for the Democrats because of the results in the Southeast, it is still very possible for Biden to come back in this race, and we'll just see in the next upcoming week. So that's all I have for you, Dana.
Fascinating stuff, Chris. Thank you so much for making sense of a very different and a very tight election And a big thank you to you and Delaney and Sophie for providing all of these updates throughout the night.
Thank you so much.
So we have one last segment for you tonight. My co-anchor Sophie Hills will be interviewing our special guest, Story Hinckley. Hinckley is a political reporter from the Christian Science Monitor and has been closely looking at the 2020 election for a while now. We're so glad that she can be with us tonight, and I'll let Sophie take it from here.
Hi, Story. Thanks so much for joining.
Hi.
You're becoming a familiar face at Prin after you joined us for Monitor Night Live earlier this year.
Oh, well, good. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing for you guys.
Well, so you've been crisscrossing the country for the last year, right? Talking to every kind of person about politics. So I'm very excited to hear some of your insights. You're in Pennsylvania right now, correct?
Yes, my wonderful Pennsylvania hotel room.
Yes, scenic. So there are a lot of eyes on Pennsylvania tonight. Why is it being so closely watched, this election?
Well, because I think that people on both sides and both campaigns see it as kind of a must win. I mean, the only state that kind of compares in its must winnableness is maybe Florida, but that's kind of one-sided. It's, you know, if Trump doesn't win Florida, his path to 270 gets really, really hard, if not impossible. But that's not looking like it'll be the case. It looks like Trump will win Florida. And then, so then after that, Pennsylvania is the one it's 20 electoral college votes, which is a lot, and it's going to be really close. And we're not going to probably know for a couple days because Pennsylvania doesn't start counting their mail-in ballots until Election Day. So they don't do any of the pre-counting that some of the other states do.
Yeah. What are you seeing there right now, and what do you expect just from being there?
So I think this with the returns of all the states, we need to be cautious before we think that we know the results one direction or the other, because voters of different parties tend to vote very differently. Republicans are much more likely to vote in person on Election Day, whereas Democrats are more likely to vote by mail-in ballots or vote in person early. And when those returns come in, will differ. So it can look like one candidate is really sweeping a state, and then we'll get the mail-ins and that will change. Or I've seen a state or two that is actually reporting some of the mail-ins first, but it's going to go back and forth a lot. But so what I've been seeing here is a lot of, I'm getting texts from friends and family on both sides saying, why are the margins up so big here? Or they're so big here. And I mean, there's big turnout on both sides. Trump supporters love him more than ever, and those who oppose him dislike him more than ever. And so I think what we can say for sure is that this year will be a year of record turnout.
So earlier today, you predicted either a Biden blowout or a very close race.
I really narrowed it down for you.
You did. So, but not a Trump blowout. So how, based on what we've seen so far, is there anything that surprised you or that may have your predictions changed at all?
No. So, I mean, this morning I said, I kind of laid those two out as the two scenarios, and I sort of said I didn't think a Trump blowout was likely, just because he would have to expand on his 2016 map, which seems really unlikely. And so of the two, a Biden blowout or a nail biter, I had said that I leaned towards thinking it would be a nail biter. And based on what I've seen of the returns, I think that that's going to be the case. I think that people on both sides were hoping that we wouldn't need Pennsylvania, because with it is likely going to come a lot of controversy, and there's going to be a lag time of when we know the results of this election, and then the results are going to change because mail-in ballots are going to start getting counted. And so I think both campaigns didn't want to need Pennsylvania, but I think they're both going to end up needing Pennsylvania. So I should have packed more clothes, probably.
So pivoting a little bit, there's been a lot of talk about division and polarization over the last 4 years and during this campaign season. In your reporting around the country, are people truly as divided as what we often think, or have you observed common ground between people?
So I think the polarization exists and it's real and it's strong. And it's almost on every issue. But when you really start talking to people and you start trying to kind of peel back the layers on that, what you find is that two people will have starkly different views on an issue or a politician or a policy or a law, and they can't be on further sides of the spectrum. But when you get underneath of what it is that that voter likes or dislikes about said policy, they have the same motivations and the causes. Everyone, I was just talking about this with another Monitor staffer, but these two voters both want their family, they want to have good paying jobs. They want a bright future for their children. They want their family to be safe. And so while they might want to go about it through very different politicians and through very different policies, that root motivating factors often really kind of the same.
And just my very last question, are you planning on being in Pennsylvania until the state is called?
Oh my goodness, I don't know. I'm based in DC, and so luckily it's not a long drive. I mean, I'm in sort of like central southern Pennsylvania, so I got here in 2 hours today. This is unrelated, but I moved apartments yesterday just because, I didn't have anything going on this week. I just thought it would be a good time to move apartments. So I, unpacked my bed and then just unpacked enough clothes to like be in Pennsylvania for a few days. So I'll probably have to go back, repack, but then something tells me I'll be back here probably as soon as this weekend.
So whether or not you're in Pennsylvania this week, what do you kind of expect for the next 3 or 4 days? Because, we're not used to waiting multiple days.
Yeah.
For results.
I don't know. I mean, the only thing I can compare it to is I was in Iowa for the Iowa caucus this year, which, if you remember, was that kind of the crazy hubbub of they didn't know the results for a while. And it was a lot of confusion. So I do expect a lot of confusion. I just hope that other news outlets and media pundits, they don't jump to conclusions, because then that kind of just adds to the confusion and hopefully no violence. But I will say that DC before I left was almost entirely boarded up.
Yeah. Well, we will all hang in there. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Of course. Great job, everyone.
I'll hand it back to Dina. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Sophie and Story. That was a great interview. Great to hear from someone kind of on the inside. And yeah, that does it for this year's Prin at the Polls broadcast. Let's bring all of the anchors back out, as well as the crew who have been so important in handling the technical side of this production. We definitely couldn't have done it without them. Let's have a moment to just wave and say hi to everybody watching. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much for everyone who was involved in this and for the support on the faculty side as well. And thank you to all of the viewers who stuck with us the entire way, as well as those who joined us where they could. We hope that our program was an informative and entertaining way to spend a rather stressful election night. And we want to thank you again so much for watching, and we'll see you in 2022.